We begin not with a trauma, but with a silence. The kind of silence that surrounds a child who learns. Too early. That praise must be earned. That affection is conditional. And that love, real love, might come with a scorecard. In the world of self-hate, the seed is rarely an explosion. It's a slow erosion, one that begins not with loud rejection, but with quiet omission. You were probably praised when you performed, when you got the grade, when you smiled at the right time, when your behavior made others comfortable, and you were ignored or gently corrected, when you simply existed without offering anything. That is how the self becomes a product, something measured, evaluated, managed, and eventually distrusted. Most people who carry self-hate don't scream it. They don't say, "I hate myself" out loud. Instead, they live it in micro-decisions, declining invitations, over-apologizing, sabotaging their own success, staying in places where they're mistreated. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, but it is relentless. And it begins with perception. Not how the world sees you, but how you learn to see yourself through the eyes of others. When a child learns that her worth comes from pleasing others, she internalizes the gaze of her parents, teachers, and peers. She learns that her real self must be kept in check, curated, made smaller. She begins to see her own needs as burdens, her own opinions as threats, her own emotions as flaws. This isn't about one bad parent or one harsh comment. It's about repetition, consistency. A child who grows up without emotional reflection, without someone mirroring back that she is acceptable, even in her messy, angry, loud, confused moments, does not learn self-love. She learns self-editing. She becomes an actor in her own life. And over time, the role becomes reality. One of the most misunderstood elements of self-hate is its functionality. It serves a purpose. It creates control. If you hate yourself before anyone else can, then no one can hurt you more than you already hurt yourself. It's a kind of preemptive strike, a way to manage disappointment, to prepare for abandonment, to reduce the pain of rejection by turning rejection into something you initiated. But that logic has a cost, because what begins as protection turns into prophecy. When you hate yourself, you seek environments that match that belief. Not because you enjoy pain, but because you crave coherence. A person who believes she is unworthy will be deeply uncomfortable in relationships that challenge that belief. She will distrust kindness. She will downplay compliments. She will gravitate toward partners, jobs, and friendships that reflect the same message she's already absorbed. You are not enough. It is not a coincidence. It's psychological homeostasis. The self wants to stay in familiar territory, even if that territory is painful, because what's familiar feels safe, even when it's destructive. So what happens over time? You don't just hate who you are. You begin to hate who you're not. You compare yourself constantly, not because you admire others, but because every comparison confirms your inferiority. You collect evidence. Look how confident she is. Look how successful he is. Look how happy they seem. And instead of inspiring you, it reinforces the silent belief you've always carried. I don't belong. And that belief becomes invisible scaffolding for every part of your life. You might still smile in public. You might still achieve. You might still be the person others describe as capable, kind, dependable. But inside, there is a fundamental discomfort with being seen. Compliments feel like lies. Praise feels temporary. Love feels dangerous. Because if someone truly sees you, they'll leave, right? This is how self-hate hides in plain sight. Not in dramatic self-destruction, but in self-minimization. You shrink so others won't notice your flaws. You give so others won't reject you. You perform so others won't get close enough to see what you believe is underneath, someone unworthy. And here's where it gets deeper. The more you perform, the more disconnected you become from your own self. Not just emotionally, but neurologically. You begin to lose access to your real desires, your preferences, your intuition, because every decision passes through the filter of fear. What will they think? Will this make me lovable? Will this make me safe? Eventually, you don't even know who you are outside the roles you've created. And that is the final betrayal. Because now, even if someone loves you, they're not loving you. They're loving the version of you you created for safety. And so the self-hate deepens, not because you're unlovable, but because love doesn't feel real anymore. That's why compliments bounce off. That's why therapy feels slow. That's why change feels threatening. Because letting go of self-hate means losing the only strategy that's kept you safe, control through self-rejection. So what's the way forward? Not self-love. Not yet. That's too distant, too abstract. The first step isn't to love yourself. It's to observe yourself, to notice when you minimize, when you flinch at kindness, when you deflect praise. Not to judge it, not to fight it, just to name it. Because awareness breaks pattern. And as the pattern weakens, you begin to see the scaffolding, the structure, the system you built to survive. And then slowly, gently, you can begin to ask different questions. What if I didn't have to earn love? What if worth isn't something I prove, but something I protect? What if I've never actually seen myself, only the version I thought others would accept? This is not easy work, but it is real. And it doesn't begin with shouting affirmations in the mirror. It begins with understanding how the mirror got distorted in the first place. Because the mirror is not broken. You just never looked closely. The voice in your head isn't yours. We often assume our thoughts are personal, private signals of who we are. But in truth, many of the thoughts that guide, punish, or limit us were never truly ours. They were introduced, repeated, reinforced, and then made permanent. If you live with a persistent undercurrent of self-hate, it's likely that the inner critic in your mind is not a reflection of your true self, but a long-lasting echo of someone else. That voice in your head, it probably has a tone, maybe impatient, maybe cold. Maybe it uses the same phrases someone once said to you. Maybe it mocks. Maybe it doubts. And maybe it never shuts off. You hear it in moments of uncertainty. When you're about to try something new. When you stand in front of a mirror. When you fail. When you're alone. When you're tired. It's there, narrating your life through a filter of inadequacy. But here's the disturbing part. You don't remember inviting it in. Most people don't. Because this voice wasn't introduced with cruelty. It came with structure, with discipline, with advice. It came from a parent who wanted you to improve, from a teacher who wanted results, from a culture that rewards comparison. Slowly, that voice became your standard. Not because it was helpful, but because it was always there. And when something is constant, it begins to feel natural. Think back. Were you criticized for being too emotional? Were you told you were too sensitive? Were you made to feel that mistakes were failures of character, not steps in learning? Did praise come only when you matched a model of behavior, of appearance, of achievement? If so, you were taught something quietly violent, that your natural self isn't acceptable. And so you split. You created a version of yourself that others would tolerate or applaud, and buried the parts that felt unacceptable. That is the foundation of the internal voice. It is the enforcer of the false self. It keeps you in line, keeps you small, keeps you from becoming someone who might be seen, rejected, or abandoned. It is not a coach. It is not your conscience. It is a prison guard trained by the people who shaped your self-concept. And like a good guard, it doesn't sleep. It comments on your appearance, your choices, your relationships, your body, your pace in life. It says things like, "You're not trying hard enough. They don't really like you. You're going to mess this up. She's better than you. Why did you say that? You're too much, or not enough." And you listen, not because you agree, but because deep down, you're afraid it might be right. This is where it gets psychological. The inner critic thrives not on truth, but on familiarity. Your brain would rather accept a painful belief that feels consistent than risk the discomfort of uncertainty. That's why positive feedback often feels fake. That's why kindness is hard to accept. That's why compliments make you uncomfortable, because they contradict the script. And when something contradicts the internal narrative, the brain experiences dissonance. And it doesn't like dissonance, so it rejects the compliment. It deflects the care. It clings to the familiar voice because that voice is predictable, and predictability feels safe, even when it hurts. So you begin to reinforce the voice yourself, not consciously, but through repetition. Every time you avoid a challenge because you're not good enough. Every time you over-explain because you're a burden. Every time you smile when you want to cry because your feelings don't matter. Those actions tell your brain, the critic is right. And the longer you reinforce it, the deeper it embeds into your identity. Now here's the quiet tragedy. Many people think this voice is just who they are. They don't question it. They don't separate from it. They think self-hate is part of their personality. But it's not. It's a survival strategy, a belief system, a conditioned habit. And like any habit, it can be changed, but not by force. It can only be changed by recognition. You can't fight the inner critic by arguing with it. That only gives it more airtime. You can't drown it out with affirmations you don't believe. That creates more dissonance. The only path forward is to identify it for what it is, a voice you inherited. Not a truth, not your essence, a pattern. And patterns can be unlearned. But to unlearn it, you must stop identifying with it. That means creating a pause, a moment of awareness when the critic speaks. Instead of reacting, you notice. You say, "That's not my voice. That's the script." And you breathe, and you wait, and you ask, where did that belief come from? Whose voice does that sound like? At first, this will feel strange, even hollow. But the more you do it, the more distance you create between the observer and the voice. And that distance is power, because in that space, you can make a new choice. You can choose not to believe it. That doesn't mean you replace it with blind positivity. It means you replace it with curiosity. Instead of, "I'm such an idiot," you ask, "Why am I feeling this way?" Instead of, "No one cares," you ask, "What would it look like to care for myself in this moment?" Instead of, "I'll never be good enough," you ask, "Good enough for whom? And why do they get to decide?" This shift from judgment to inquiry is where healing begins. Because self-hate is a closed loop. It assumes the worst, confirms the worst, and reinforces the worst. But inquiry opens the loop. It introduces new possibilities. It allows new evidence. It creates space for self-compassion, not as a luxury, but as a psychological necessity. Here's what no one tells you. The goal is not to eliminate the inner critic. It may never fully go away. The goal is to disempower it, to stop giving it the final word, to recognize its presence, but no longer hand it the mic. Because the voice in your head, it isn't you. It never was. And the moment you realize that, you create a different kind of silence, the kind that heals. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of space, where your real voice can finally speak. When success feels like a mistake, there's a particular discomfort that no one warns you about. It happens quietly, often in private. You achieve something. You win. You get the job, the degree, the compliment, the opportunity. And instead of feeling proud, or fulfilled, or excited, you feel sick. It feels like you're wearing someone else's name tag, like you've tricked people into believing something about you that isn't real. And worse, now you have to keep pretending, keep performing, keep proving you deserve what you already have. This is not imposter syndrome in the popular sense. It runs deeper. This is self-hate disguised as humility. It's the internal narrative that says, "You don't really deserve this. You just got lucky." Eventually, they'll find out who you really are. And underneath that narrative is a painful assumption. If I succeed, I must be lying. To understand this, we have to revisit something uncomfortable: how your definition of self was built in the first place. Most people assume self-hate arises when you fail too often. But for many, it forms even in moments of success, because success contradicts their internal image of who they are. If you grew up believing that love had to be earned, that nothing you did was ever quite enough, that affection was tied to performance, then even your successes came with strings attached. You weren't allowed to feel proud. You were trained to feel relieved, and then afraid of losing it all. Success was never celebrated for what it was. It was tolerated, or quickly minimized. Don't let it get to your head. That's nice. But what's next? You're only as good as your last result. And so you learned to distrust success. You learned that achievement wasn't proof of worth. It was an exception to your usual failure. And exceptions aren't safe. They create expectations, pressure, risk. And for someone who carries self-hate like a second skin, that pressure is unbearable. Because at your core, you don't just feel unworthy, you feel like a mistake that hasn't been discovered yet. This belief is more than emotional. It's neurological. Your brain adapts to repeated narratives. If you've spent years reinforcing the idea that you're flawed, broken, or fundamentally not enough, your brain builds its internal wiring around that script. Every experience is filtered through it, including success. So when something good happens, your mind rejects it like a foreign body. You rationalize it away. They must have felt sorry for me. It was probably a fluke. They don't really know the real me. You can't absorb the joy, because joy feels suspicious, dangerous, like something that will be taken away the moment you let your guard down. That's why compliments make you cringe. That's why milestones feel hollow. That's why you downplay your achievements. Because you were never taught that success could coexist with imperfection. Instead, you were taught that being imperfect means being unworthy of good things. So what happens next? You sabotage, not intentionally, but subtly. You procrastinate. You underperform. You overprepare to the point of exhaustion. You avoid opportunities that might actually move you forward. You say no when you want to say yes. You say yes when you want to say no. All of it in service of one unconscious goal: to shrink your life until it matches your self-image. This is where it becomes destructive, because the more you succeed, the more dissonance you feel. And that dissonance doesn't lead to growth. It leads to collapse. You burn out. You disappear. You walk away from things you once dreamed about, not because they're wrong for you, but because they're too right, too good, too incompatible with the version of yourself you secretly believe in. And that version? It's one you never consciously chose. It was handed to you, built from the feedback you got when you were too young to question it, formed in environments where emotional safety depended on compliance, modesty, invisibility, in places where your light had to be dimmed so others could feel comfortable. So even now, as an adult, when someone sees your value, when they celebrate you, promote you, admire you, you shrink. Not because you're humble, but because deep down, you don't believe it's safe to be seen. And so, paradoxically, success becomes a threat. It threatens the entire psychological structure you've lived inside for years. A structure built on the belief that being small is safer than being fully alive. This is the unseen prison of self-hate. It doesn't always scream. It doesn't always show up in breakdowns or dramatic failures. Sometimes, it wears a smile. It shows up in high-functioning, high-achieving individuals who seem put together, but feel hollow. They check every box but feel none of the joy. They reach every goal but feel none of the pride. And then they blame themselves for that. 2. This is the moment when healing becomes possible. Not through more achievement, but through reconstruction. You don't need more praise. You need to rebuild your internal architecture, the system by which you determine who you are and what you deserve. And that starts with a question no one taught you to ask. What if nothing is wrong with me? Not in a superficial, self-help way, but in a literal sense. What if the discomfort you feel isn't proof of your brokenness, but evidence of a false belief system being challenged? What if success doesn't feel like yours because you were taught, over and over, that you had to earn your right to exist? And what if that teaching was wrong? This is not about ego. It's not about delusion. It's about recalibrating your sense of self-worth so that it's no longer conditional on performance, so that success doesn't have to trigger fear, so that joy doesn't have to feel foreign, so that being seen doesn't feel like a trap. And here's the quiet truth no one tells you. Your fear of success is not laziness. It's grief. Grief for all the times you succeeded and no one celebrated. Grief for the child who learned that joy was dangerous. Grief for the parts of you that you had to bury just to be acceptable. Grief for a lifetime spent shrinking so others wouldn't leave. But grief can become clarity. It can show you what was stolen and what you can reclaim, because your success was never a mistake. The mistake was believing you had to be someone else to deserve it. Why you apologize for existing? There are two kinds of apologies. The kind that makes sense, and the kind you say without knowing why. Sorry when someone bumps into you. Sorry before sharing your opinion. Sorry for speaking, for taking space, for needing time, for making a request, for existing. This kind of apology is not about politeness. It's about permission. Deep down, many people aren't saying sorry because they made a mistake. They're saying it because they believe their presence is the mistake. Self-hate doesn't always sound harsh. Sometimes, it sounds like quiet submission, like soft-spoken disclaimers, like minimizing your words so others won't feel burdened, like keeping the peace at your own expense. It sounds like, sorry, I don't mean to bother you, when what you actually need is support. Let's look at where this starts. Children don't enter the world believing they're a nuisance. They learn it, often without a single cruel word being spoken. It happens in moments where they're told to be quiet instead of being heard, when their tears are dismissed instead of comforted, when their energy is too much, their needs are inconvenient, their emotions are labeled as dramatic. They learn to monitor themselves, to avoid conflict, to become small before anyone asks them to. Because being easy is safer than being authentic. And from that conditioning comes the reflexive apology, not just for actions, but for identity. People raised in emotionally unpredictable environments often become highly sensitive to other people's moods. They become expert readers of the room. They know when to retreat, when to soften, when to smile through discomfort. This sensitivity can look like empathy, but it often hides something deeper: fear. Fear of being too much. Fear of taking up space. Fear that the moment you assert your needs, you will be punished or abandoned. And so you apologize. You say sorry, not because you did something wrong, but because you feel like something is wrong with you. That feeling, chronic, ambient, hard to name, is the shadow of self-hate. It doesn't explode. It lingers. It shapes how you speak, how you move, how you relate to others. You offer disclaimers before opinions. You wait for invitations before acting. You avoid conflict, even when you're right. You over-explain simple things. You keep peace by suppressing truth. You become agreeable to the point of erasure. And you call it being nice. But niceness, when rooted in fear, is not kindness. It's self-abandonment. Because every time you apologize for existing, you reinforce the message you absorbed early on. I am a disruption. I am a burden. I must not inconvenience anyone. This internalized belief system doesn't stop at apologies. It shapes your entire emotional life. You struggle to set boundaries, not because you don't know how, but because you don't feel entitled to them. You hesitate to ask for help, not because you don't need it, but because you think needing help makes you weak. You put other people's comfort above your own, not because you're generous, but because you fear rejection. And the result? You become invisible. Not in a literal sense, but in a psychological one. You fade from your own life. Your choices revolve around avoiding conflict, earning approval, and reducing your presence to something manageable. You become liked, but not known, needed, but not respected, surrounded, but not seen. And this invisibility is exhausting, because no matter how much you apologize, how much you give, how small you make yourself, you never feel safe. You're always one step away from disappointing someone, one step away from losing connection, one step away from being found out. This is the cycle. Fear, self-minimization, temporary relief, deeper self-hate. Because every time you apologize for who you are, you teach yourself that who you are is a problem. So how do you break this? Not by becoming aggressive, not by swinging to the opposite extreme, not by forcing confidence, but by beginning, quietly, to challenge the premise. What if your presence isn't a burden? What if being yourself doesn't require a disclaimer? What if taking space is not a threat, but a right? These questions sound small, but psychologically, they are seismic. They cut directly into the core belief of the self-hating mind, that your value is conditional, that you exist to serve, to smooth, to never make waves. Challenging that belief doesn't mean becoming loud. It means becoming real. It means speaking without apologizing for your tone, asking for what you need without a preamble, letting your face show when you're tired or frustrated or disappointed, saying no without explaining, saying yes because you mean it, not because you feel pressured. This isn't easy. The first time you stop apologizing, you'll feel guilt. The second time, you'll feel fear. The third time, you'll feel disoriented. And the fourth, you might feel something unfamiliar, relief, because you're no longer negotiating your existence. You're showing up as you are, without the apology. This shift is not about ego. It's about returning to yourself, the parts of you that learned, too early, that safety meant silence, that love required shrinking, that acceptance was earned by erasing your edges. You don't owe anyone an apology for being here. You never did. And the moment you stop offering one, your life begins to sound different, not just to others, but to yourself. It's not louder. It's clearer. Why you can't accept love without doubt. Love, for some people, doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a test, a puzzle with hidden conditions, a pleasant dream they expect to wake up from. Not because they don't want love, but because somewhere deep inside, they believe they don't deserve it. This is one of the quieter wounds of self-hate, the inability to receive love without suspicion. At first glance, it doesn't look like self-hate. It looks like humility, like independence, like strength. You tell yourself you're just careful, that you don't want to rely on others, that you have high standards, that you're not the emotional type. That trust takes time. But what if it's not caution? What if it's disbelief? What if every time someone offers you affection, support, kindness, attention, your first reaction isn't warmth, but anxiety? There's a reason for that. If you carry a long-standing internal belief that you are fundamentally flawed, unworthy, broken, or inadequate, then any act of love creates a contradiction. Someone sees you as lovable, while you see yourself as defective. The result is cognitive dissonance, a tension between two opposing realities. And that tension doesn't feel romantic. It feels unsafe. To relieve it, the mind looks for ways to explain away the love. They don't really know me. They'll change their mind. They're just being nice. They're probably like everyone else. This won't last. You question the motives. You anticipate the exit. You brace for the betrayal. Not because the other person is untrustworthy, but because you don't trust yourself to be truly worthy of what they're offering. And here's the cruel twist. The more intense the love, the more unbearable the dissonance. Because it exposes a truth you've been avoiding, that maybe you've never really let yourself be seen. Many people who struggle with self-hate become masters of disguise. They curate a version of themselves they think others will accept. They're pleasant, helpful, emotionally contained. They're supportive friends, good listeners, reliable partners. But inside, there's a sense of performance, a fear that if they ever stopped being useful, the love would vanish. And so when someone loves them without conditions, when someone says, "You don't have to earn it," they freeze. Because that's unfamiliar territory. There's no script for it, no clear role to play, just presence. And when your entire identity has been built around self-editing, just being becomes unbearable. So what do? You deflect the love. You laugh off compliments. You avoid vulnerability. You downplay your needs. You create emotional distance. Not because you don't want connection, but because you believe connection comes at a cost you can't afford. Exposure. Exposure of what? The belief that if someone saw the real you, your fears, your mess, your contradictions, they would leave. That they'd finally confirm what you've suspected all along, that you are not enough. This belief is not just emotional. It's historical. It often traces back to early relationships where love was conditional, where affection was offered based on behavior, where mistakes led to withdrawal, where being good meant suppressing your truth. In those environments, love becomes currency, and you learn that to be loved, you must be someone else. So when someone shows up now and offers you love as you are, your nervous system doesn't relax, it panics, because it feels like a trick. And this is where many people get stuck. They blame themselves for being too guarded or too broken. But what's really happening is a misalignment of emotional truths. You're trying to receive love while believing you're unlovable. You're trying to let someone in while guarding the parts of you that need love the most. And the only way out is not to force yourself to trust, it's to update the belief. That process is slow. It begins with noticing your reactions, not changing them, not judging them, just observing. How do you feel when someone compliments you? When someone supports you? When someone stays after you've shown weakness? What's the first thought that enters your mind? That thought is the key. It's the internalized voice of self-hate, narrating your relationships before they even begin. And until you identify it, you'll keep confusing self-protection with emotional truth. You'll think the discomfort you feel is a signal that something is wrong with the other person, when it's really an echo of something old, something learned. And if you can pause in that moment, if you can say, "This discomfort doesn't mean I'm unsafe. It means I'm stepping outside the script," then something new can begin. Not instant trust, not perfect vulnerability, but space. Space for a different story. Because here's the quiet truth. The love you resist the most is often the love you needed the earliest. The love that said, "You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to perform. You can be scared, messy, slow, complicated, and still be held." That's not fantasy. That's healing. And healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in small moments. When someone offers love and you pause before rejecting it. When you let the compliment linger, even if you don't believe it. When you share something honest and wait, not for rejection, but for recognition. And when it comes, you let it in. Not all at once, just a little. Because accepting love when you hate yourself is not about being ready. It's about being willing. Willing to sit with the tension. Willing to not trust the first impulse. Willing to believe that maybe, just maybe, the story you were told about your worth is not the only one. And in that space, love stops being a threat. It becomes a mirror. One that shows you not who you think you are, but who you've always been, beneath the performance, beneath the fear, beneath the doubt. Not perfect, but real. And real is enough. The safety of being misunderstood. It might sound strange, but some people feel safest when they are not understood. Not because they enjoy distance, but because understanding brings exposure. And exposure is the one thing the self-hating mind fears most. This dynamic is subtle. It doesn't begin with a conscious decision to hide. It begins with early experiences where being seen led to shame, where the parts of you that felt the most natural, your emotions, your needs, your curiosity, were met not with warmth, but with discomfort, judgment, or indifference. So you learn not to express those parts, not to reveal too much, not to make things complicated. And slowly, misunderstanding became protective. When people don't fully understand you, there's a buffer, a distance, a margin of emotional safety. If they don't fully know you, they can't reject you for the real you. If they misinterpret your silence, your humor, your avoidance, it hurts less than if they saw your truth and still walked away. That's the painful logic of the self-hating system. It teaches you to trade connection for safety. You let others know only the parts of you that feel socially acceptable. You become agreeable. You speak in generalities. You nod, even when you disagree. You hold back emotions until they pass. You make yourself easy to digest. And people like you, but you never feel known. That's because you've mistaken invisibility for protection. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling emptier than before, this might be why. If you've ever been surrounded by people and still felt deeply alone, this is part of it. It's not that others are cruel or neglectful. It's that you've made a habit out of partial self-expression. And that habit isn't born out of manipulation. It's born out of learned emotional logic, that if you keep parts of yourself hidden, you can never be fully rejected. This habit reinforces itself over time. The less you're understood, the less you're hurt. And so your nervous system equates misunderstanding with safety. You start to mistrust closeness. You might even push people away when they get too curious or too caring. Not because you dislike them, but because you fear what they might discover. And here's the deeper psychological layer. Being misunderstood allows you to maintain your self-hate. If someone says they love you, and they don't fully know you, then their love doesn't count. That's how your mind protects the belief that you're unworthy. You tell yourself, if they really knew me, they'd feel differently. And so, paradoxically, staying misunderstood becomes a way to preserve the negative self-image you've carried for years. It's a closed system. You hide your true self to avoid rejection. You receive love for a curated version of you. You dismiss that love because it's not directed at the real you. And then you continue believing that the real you is unlovable. Round and round. And it doesn't stop unless you begin to challenge the foundation. The assumption that being understood is dangerous. Ask yourself this. When did being seen become threatening? Was it a parent who didn't respond well to your feelings? A teacher who embarrassed you? A friend who withdrew when you were honest? Was it a pattern, not a moment, of emotional mismatch? If so, then your nervous system has a valid reason for equating visibility with vulnerability. But emotional logic from the past doesn't always serve the present. And continuing to live by that logic now means locking yourself out of the very thing you most deeply want, real connection. That's the paradox. People with self-hate often long for intimacy. They crave understanding. They imagine being truly known, deeply accepted, fully loved. But when those moments begin to materialize, they panic. They retreat. They become vague, deflective, sarcastic, avoidant, or overly agreeable. Not because they want to push people away, but because they don't believe it's safe to be truly close. So the cycle continues. You maintain the distance. You protect the image. You tell yourself it's better this way. And yet, there's a grief that builds. Grief for all the things you didn't say. All the times you bit your tongue. All the moments when you had a chance to be known, and you chose safety instead. Eventually, the loneliness of being misunderstood becomes heavier than the fear of being seen. And that's when change becomes possible. Not through dramatic confessions or sudden vulnerability, but through small shifts. You say one thing a little more honestly. You stay 1 second longer in discomfort. You let someone in just a bit further than feels comfortable. You share a part of yourself without waiting for it to be perfectly worded. And when nothing bad happens, when they don't walk away, you begin to accumulate new data, not just intellectually, but emotionally. You begin to realize maybe you don't have to be misunderstood to be safe. Maybe the parts you've hidden are not too much. Maybe being seen is not a threat, but a path toward integration. Because what self-hate fragments, understanding can begin to restore. When someone reflects back to you that your feelings make sense, that your needs are valid, that your complexity is human, you begin to rewrite the script. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And you don't start by trusting others blindly. You start by trusting that the belief you learned, that being seen is dangerous, is not a law of nature. It was a survival strategy, a smart one, but one that's no longer necessary in every context. This is where healing starts, not with certainty, but with permission. Permission to speak without shrinking. Permission to feel without filtering. Permission to be known, not just admired. And when that permission grows stronger than the fear of exposure, something inside shifts. You stop needing to be misunderstood, because you've stopped believing that the truth of who you are is something to hide. Why you can't forgive yourself for ordinary mistakes. There are people who live with the weight of things that no one else remembers. A pause in conversation, a sentence said the wrong way, a moment of clumsiness or poor judgment. These aren't major failures. They're small, human moments. But for some, they replay endlessly, each time, louder than before. If you live with self-hate, chances are you carry a deep intolerance for your own imperfection, not just in big events, but in ordinary mistakes. A forgotten message, a wrong word, a missed opportunity. These things don't pass through you. They stick. They linger. They collect in a quiet mental archive that no one else can see. You tell yourself you've moved on, but at night, or during quiet moments, they return. The memory of who you weren't, of what you didn't do, of how you could have been better. To others, it might seem like overthinking, but it's not that simple. It's self-punishment, a silent, ongoing effort to fix the past through guilt. And underneath that guilt is a dangerous assumption, that mistakes make you less worthy. This belief doesn't come from nowhere. It's built, usually early. If you were raised in an environment where small mistakes brought big reactions, anger, silence, disappointment, rejection, your nervous system adapted. It started treating mistakes not as events, but as threats. You learned that messing up meant being less lovable, that making errors led to distance, that imperfection had a cost. So you internalized a rule: don't make mistakes. And if you do, feel bad enough to prove you understand how wrong you were. This emotional logic follows you into adulthood, even in safe relationships, even when no one's watching. The guilt becomes automatic, a reflex. You apologize too much. You explain yourself in circles. You obsess over things that can't be changed, not to repair them, but to punish yourself. Because somewhere inside, you still believe that self-punishment is the only way to protect your relationships. If I hurt enough, maybe they won't leave. If I admit how awful it was, maybe they'll forgive me. If I hate myself first, maybe they won't have to. But this never brings peace, because the guilt doesn't end. It expands. One mistake becomes proof of your identity. You don't say, I did something wrong. You say, I am wrong. You don't just remember the incident, you remember the feeling, the shame, the panic, the moment you felt exposed. And that's what sticks. So even when others have long forgotten your mistake, even when they've forgiven you, or never even noticed, you're still stuck in it, still trying to rewrite the moment, still holding yourself hostage to a version of the past that doesn't exist anymore. This isn't just emotional, it's neurological. The brain encodes shame memories differently. They're linked to survival. When you're a child and you disappoint someone you depend on, your brain treats it like danger. That memory is filed under never forget. Not because it's significant, but because it felt unsafe. And so years later, the same response is triggered by far smaller events. A minor social misstep feels like moral failure. A small delay in response feels like betrayal. A tone of voice you can't control becomes a personal disgrace. This is not sensitivity. It's a system on high alert, trained to equate imperfection with danger. And in that system, self-forgiveness feels impossible. Because forgiveness requires two things: recognizing your mistake and believing that it doesn't define your worth. But if your core belief is that mistakes do define you, then forgiveness feels like self-deception. You tell yourself, if I let this go, I'm letting myself off the hook. If I stop feeling bad, it means I didn't care. If I forgive myself, I'm not being accountable. But guilt is not accountability. Guilt is an emotion. Accountability is an action. And when guilt is used as a substitute for action, it becomes a form of emotional paralysis. You think you're being responsible by holding on to the guilt. But really, you're avoiding something harder: self-compassion. Because self-compassion isn't about ignoring your mistakes. It's about seeing them clearly and choosing not to define yourself by them. It's about saying, yes, I got it wrong, and I'm still allowed to be whole. This is not indulgence. It's maturity. It's psychological integration. And it's the only real way forward. So why does it feel so wrong? Because you were never shown how to do it. You saw adults who punished themselves, who lashed out when they messed up, who disappeared into silence or blame. You saw shame, but not resolution. You saw guilt, but not growth. And so now, when you try to forgive yourself, it feels unfamiliar. It feels unsafe. Your mind says, you should be harder on yourself. You shouldn't move on so fast. You haven't earned relief. But those thoughts are echoes. They're the voice of old emotional rules. Rules that might have helped you survive once, but now keep you from evolving. The truth is, you'll never feel done enough to forgive yourself. The guilt will never resolve itself. The moment won't disappear. What changes is your response to it. Not by force, not by affirmations, but by a quiet shift from punishment to reflection, from shame to responsibility, from identity to learning. You begin to say, I am not my mistake. I am the person who noticed it. That shift doesn't excuse harm. It honors growth. It says, this is part of my story, but not the whole of who I am. And over time, the part of you that equated imperfection with unworthiness begins to loosen. You see others make mistakes, and you don't recoil. You remember your own missteps and feel tenderness, not disgust. You accept help without apology. You speak honestly, even if it's messy. You show up, even when you're unsure, because you've stopped treating being wrong as a threat and started treating it as what it's always been, a part of being human. The fear of needing anything. Some people struggle with asking for help, not because they're proud, not because they believe they can do everything on their own, but because the very act of needing something from anyone triggers something deeper than discomfort. It triggers fear. Fear that needing makes you weak, that asking makes you vulnerable, that admitting dependence will cost you more than silence ever did. This isn't about stubbornness. It's about protection. For people who live with self-hate, needing something is not just a request, it's a risk of disappointment, a risk of rejection, a risk of being reminded that their needs don't matter. And for many, that fear feels more dangerous than simply going without. This pattern begins early. Children are not born ashamed of their needs. They cry, they reach out, they ask, without hesitation, for food, comfort, attention, presence. But if a child's needs are consistently met with unpredictability, if care is delayed, conditional, or emotionally costly, they begin to adapt. They learn to quiet their needs, not to stop having them, but to stop expressing them. This becomes a strategy, a way to avoid pain. You start to associate needing something with waiting, or being told no, or being met with frustration. You feel the consequences before you even make the request. So eventually, you stop making it. And what begins as survival becomes your baseline. Don't ask. Don't expect. Don't need. It's not just about others. It becomes internalized. You begin to resent your own needs. You view them as flaws. You feel shame when you're tired, embarrassment when you're overwhelmed, guilt when you want connection. You call it independence. You tell yourself you're just low maintenance. But beneath that is a deeper belief. If I don't need anything, I can't be hurt. But that belief comes at a price. The price is loneliness, exhaustion, emotional isolation, a life where you're always carrying more than you should, but convincing yourself it's fine. And here's the deeper truth. When you cut off your ability to need others, you also cut off your ability to feel fully cared for. Because to be cared for, you have to be willing to receive. And to receive, you have to admit that something is missing. And that admission, that moment where you say, I can't do this alone, that's where the self-hating voice speaks loudest. It says, you're a burden. It's your fault for feeling this way. They'll think less of you. You're just being dramatic. You should know better by now. That voice isn't logical, but it's persuasive, and it keeps you stuck in the illusion of self-reliance, even when it's slowly draining you. This fear of needing shows up in subtle ways. You say, I'm fine automatically, even when you're not. You minimize your struggles. You offer help but never accept it. You feel uncomfortable when others show concern. You get anxious when someone gets too close emotionally, because closeness implies dependence. And dependence feels like danger. Not because it is, but because it once was. Maybe someone let you down when you needed them most. Maybe they disappeared. Maybe they responded with anger or coldness. Maybe they made you feel guilty for asking. Maybe they helped, but reminded you how inconvenient it was. Whatever the reason, the lesson stuck. It's safer to not need anyone. But the cost of that safety is connection. Because connection is not built on perfection or performance. It's built on shared humanity, on interdependence, on the mutual understanding that we are not designed to do life alone. You may think that others will only love you when you're strong, composed, and self-sufficient. But the people capable of real closeness, the people worth building with, don't want your performance. They want your presence. They want the real you, even when you're messy, especially then. So how do you change this? Not by forcing yourself to ask for help with big things. That might feel too foreign. You start smaller. You allow yourself to express discomfort without apology. You let someone see you without filtering. You say, I'm not okay, without rushing to fix it. And you watch what happens. You expect rejection. You expect them to withdraw. But sometimes, they don't. They lean in. They stay. They respond with care. And your nervous system, trained for disappointment, feels confused. That confusion is the beginning of rewiring. It tells you, maybe it's not dangerous to need after all. But here's the key, you have to notice those moments. Let them land. If you rush past them or explain them away, they don't register. But if you pause, if you breathe and feel what it's like to be met with kindness when you're vulnerable, you start to build a new pattern, a new emotional logic. One that says, I can be both independent and connected. I can be capable and still need. I can ask without being ashamed. I can receive without proving my worth. This shift doesn't make your needs go away. It makes them visible. It makes them safe. It brings them out of hiding, where they've quietly shaped your life from the shadows. Because the truth is, everyone needs something. Time, touch, understanding, encouragement, space, safety. We don't outgrow this. We just get better, or worse, at acknowledging it. Self-hate tells you that needing something is weakness. Healing tells you that naming your needs is strength. And with time, the fear softens, the guilt fades, and needing stops feeling like a risk, and starts feeling like what it always was, a part of being alive. Why you feel guilty for taking up space. Some forms of pain are loud. Others are quiet and constant, like a soft pressure you carry into every room. You walk in, and part of you is already shrinking. You speak, and you wonder if you've said too much. You take a seat, and you feel you're in someone else's way. You move carefully, not because you're unsure of where you're going, but because deep down, you've internalized a belief that your existence needs to be justified. This is what it means to feel guilty for taking up space. You may not say it aloud, but your body says it for you. In how you avoid eye contact, in how you wait for others to speak first, in how you fold your arms, apologize too quickly, over-explain small things. These are not quirks. They are strategies, protective habits developed over time to avoid rejection, conflict, or emotional discomfort. At the core of this lies self-hate, not in the overt sense of dramatic self-loathing, but in a quiet, normalized belief, I'm too much, or worse, I'm not enough, and still somehow a burden. To understand how this takes root, you have to go back to how you were received as a child. If you were praised for being quiet, compliant, polite, but not for being curious, messy, loud, or emotionally expressive, you learn to associate less with safety. If you were told, directly or indirectly, that your emotions were too big, your needs too demanding, your presence disruptive, you adapted. You became smaller. Not physically, but emotionally and psychologically. You learned to read the room before speaking. You filtered your feelings. You avoided attention, even when you needed it. You translated feedback into identity. And over time, you developed an internal rule. The less of me there is, the safer I am. This rule doesn't remain isolated. It spreads. It touches how you move through your adult life. You hesitate to ask for what you want, not because you don't know what it is, but because you feel unentitled to it. You say yes when you mean no, not out of confusion, but because asserting a boundary feels like taking too much. Even compliments feel heavy. You deflect them. You make jokes. You downplay your achievements. Not because you're humble, but because being seen makes you uncomfortable. And that discomfort is tied to a deeper fear. If someone really sees me, they might not want me. This belief becomes self-fulfilling. The more you minimize yourself, the more disconnected you feel. You struggle to belong, but you're not showing up fully. You feel distant, but you're the one creating the distance. Not because you want to, but because you've learned that closeness comes with a cost, visibility. And visibility, to a self-hating mind, feels unsafe. It feels like exposure, like judgment, like a setup for rejection. So you stay small. You make yourself easier. You carry other people's discomfort and silence your own. You feel proud of being low maintenance, when really, you've just become practiced at suppression. And yet, there's a tension, because some part of you wants to be seen, to be heard, to say what you really mean. But when the moment comes, you pull back. You hesitate. You tell yourself it's not the right time. You wait for permission that never comes. This is the emotional trap. You crave authenticity, but fear its consequences. You want space, but feel ashamed of occupying it. That shame isn't rooted in logic. It's rooted in memory, in the emotional memories of being too much for someone who mattered. A parent, a teacher, a friend, someone who didn't know how to hold space for you. And so you learn to stop taking it. Over time, this becomes the only way you know how to be. But it's exhausting. You smile when you're tired. You nod when you disagree. You absorb discomfort like a sponge. You say it's okay so often that you forget what not okay feels like. And then, when you finally reach your limit, you don't explode. You retreat. You disappear. And then you feel guilty for that too. Because the self-hating system has no off switch. Even when you're quiet, it tells you that your silence is a problem. So how do you break this? Not by becoming loud or dominant, not by performing confidence, but by first noticing the pattern. The next time you feel the urge to apologize for speaking, pause. Ask yourself, am I actually doing something wrong? Or am I just uncomfortable taking up space? The next time you hide your feelings, ask, am I protecting someone else's comfort at the expense of my own? And most importantly, when someone invites you to be seen, when they ask you how you are, when they offer space for your thoughts, try not to shrink. Try saying a little more than you usually would. Try letting the silence sit for a second longer. Try believing, even briefly, that your presence is not a problem to be solved. Because that's the truth most people never hear. You don't have to earn the right to exist fully. You don't have to apologize for being visible. You don't need permission to be present. You are allowed to take up space in a conversation, in a relationship, in the world. That doesn't mean dominating. It means existing without shrinking. It means breathing without guilt, speaking without overthinking, feeling without editing. You can still be thoughtful, kind, gentle, and fully present. You don't have to disappear to be accepted. You just have to unlearn the idea that your presence is a disturbance, because it never was. When confidence feels like a lie, some people don't fear failure. They fear being seen as confident. They fear coming across as self-assured, competent, deserving, because deep down, they believe it's dishonest. That confidence, when it shows up, feels like a mask, an act, something borrowed, not earned, and so they hold it back. They step aside when it's time to speak. They downplay what they know. They soften their tone, revise their achievements, hide what they're good at, not because they're modest, but because deep down, they believe there's something fraudulent about claiming any personal strength. This isn't shyness. It's not introversion. It's not humility. It's the residue of self-hate. To live with chronic self-hate is to live with the idea that any positive view of yourself must be exaggerated, mistaken, or manipulative. You might have the credentials. You might have the skills. But as soon as someone praises you or asks you to lead or simply points out something you did well, your mind kicks in. They must be wrong. They don't know the full story. They're just being nice. You don't trust praise. You don't trust recognition. You don't trust yourself. Instead, you scan for errors. You replay what you said. You focus on what you missed. You apologize in advance. You brace for judgment. You prepare for the moment when someone finally sees the real you, the version of yourself you've spent years trying to hide or fix or disown. This dynamic often begins in childhood, not in obvious trauma, but in subtle emotional patterns. If you grew up in an environment where being too proud was punished, where confidence was called arrogance, where vulnerability was met with ridicule, where praise came with conditions, you learn not to feel good about yourself too easily. Or maybe it was inconsistent. You were praised one moment, criticized the next, celebrated, then ignored. You never knew what reaction your actions would bring. So you stopped attaching value to your strengths. You stopped trusting the feeling of being right, capable, accomplished, because confidence, to you, became emotionally dangerous. And now, as an adult, you still carry that equation. Confidence equals exposure, and exposure equals eventual humiliation or rejection. So when you succeed, you hide. When you're asked for your opinion, you second-guess. When people look to you for leadership, you freeze. When you feel capable, your first instinct is to suppress it, not because you doubt the facts, but because you doubt your right to feel proud. This is the hidden burden of high-functioning self-hate. You might appear composed, helpful, intelligent, but underneath is a mind constantly rejecting its own worth. A mind that treats self-confidence not as a right, but as a risky illusion. This becomes especially harmful when the world starts to respond to the version of you that appears confident. When you get the job, the opportunity, the compliment, and instead of feeling validated, you feel pressure. Pressure to keep up the act. Pressure to not mess it up. Pressure to maintain a persona that doesn't match how you feel inside. And that mismatch between who people think you are and who you believe yourself to be creates deep internal conflict. You live with the quiet fear that you're impersonating yourself, that any moment of success is a setup for failure, that you're being rewarded for a role you're not equipped to play. This fear doesn't motivate. It paralyzes. It keeps you from speaking when you know the answer, from applying when you're qualified, from showing up fully when you're ready. Because some part of you believes that being seen in your strength will only lead to being exposed as a fraud. And so, confidence feels like lying, even when it's real, even when you've earned it. So how do you break this cycle? Not by forcing yourself to act more confident. That only deepens the disconnect. Not by telling yourself to just believe in yourself. That oversimplifies the issue. Real healing begins with questioning the story. Who taught you that confidence was dangerous? Who made you feel that being good at something meant you were full of yourself? Where did you learn that pride is something to be ashamed of? What moments from your past taught you to disconnect from your own strengths? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary, because the story you're living now, that you have to stay small, quiet, agreeable in order to be safe, is not universal truth. It's learned behavior, behavior that once protected you, but now limits you. And here's the quiet truth you might not have heard enough. Real confidence isn't about volume. It's not about being loud or always right or without doubt. It's about alignment. It's about saying, I know who I am. I know what I bring. And I don't need to shrink for anyone. Confidence doesn't mean never being wrong. It means knowing that being wrong doesn't make you unworthy. Confidence doesn't mean always feeling sure. It means being able to move forward even when you're not. Confidence isn't arrogance. Arrogance denies weakness. Confidence accepts it without shame. And that's what self-hate won't let you do. It won't let you accept your flaws and your gifts. It says you have to be broken or brilliant, but never both. But both is the truth. You are flawed, and you are capable. You have weaknesses, and you have strengths. You make mistakes, and you get things right. And you don't need to pretend otherwise. So the next time confidence appears, don't suppress it. Don't apologize. Don't label it as fake. Let it be quiet. Let it be real. Let it be yours. Because it always was. Why you can't let go of people who hurt you. There's a common assumption that letting go is about strength. That walking away from someone who harmed you is a sign of power, of knowing your worth, of reclaiming your self-respect. But for some people, it isn't that simple. For some, the hardest people to let go of are the ones who hurt them most. This doesn't come from weakness. It comes from psychological programming, a logic built from years of emotional conditioning, often beneath awareness. You don't hold on to pain because you enjoy it. You hold on to people who caused it because, on some level, you still believe the story isn't finished, that something is unresolved. That maybe, if you try hard enough, behave better, explain yourself clearly, or just wait long enough, the ending will change. This isn't delusion. It's a deeply ingrained emotional survival strategy, especially common in those who live with chronic self-hate. Here's how it works. If you were raised in a dynamic where love was inconsistent, where affection was tied to performance, or where caretakers fluctuated between warmth and withdrawal, your emotional system adapted. It didn't just crave connection, it craved resolution, a sense of stability, a feeling that the people who hurt you could also heal you. This is where it gets complicated. When someone mistreats you, but also gives you occasional moments of approval, attention, or affection, your brain begins to link pain with hope. The same person who hurt you is the one you look to for comfort. That loop doesn't break easily. It becomes addictive, not because the relationship is healthy, but because your self-worth is tied to it. You're not just trying to be loved. You're trying to prove you deserve it. You're trying to redeem yourself by making it work. That's the hidden engine of many self-destructive attachments. They aren't about love. They're about self-validation. You think, if I can get them to treat me better, I'll finally feel like I matter. So you stay. You tolerate. You hope. And when things inevitably go wrong, you don't blame the other person. You blame yourself. You tell yourself you weren't enough. You didn't say the right thing. You expected too much. You were too sensitive. You made it worse. This internal shift, from being hurt to feeling guilty for being hurt, is a signature of self-hate. You begin to believe that the pain you're experiencing is your own fault, that your standards are unrealistic, that your needs are excessive, that your emotions are inconvenient. And once that belief takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to leave. Because now, letting go isn't just about losing someone else. It feels like giving up on yourself. You've made your healing conditional on their change. And as long as you believe they might change, you can't move on. This is where the psychological trap becomes complete. You're no longer staying for them. You're staying because leaving would force you to face something more painful. The idea that you were never going to get what you needed from them in the first place. And that realization brings grief. Not just grief for the relationship, but grief for the part of you that kept trying, that kept waiting, that kept thinking, if I do it right, they'll love me the way I need. Letting go, then, becomes a kind of death. Not of hope, but of the version of you that built your identity around someone else's approval. And that is why you can't let go easily. Because walking away means admitting that the love you stayed for was never what you thought it was. It means facing the loneliness you've spent years trying to outrun. It means confronting the belief that maybe your worth isn't something they can ever give you. So what breaks this cycle? Not willpower, not anger, not even new love. What breaks it is clarity. Clarity about what you were actually seeking. Clarity about what you gave and what you lost. Clarity about what was real and what was imagined. Clarity that says, I stayed because I wanted to believe in something that wasn't there. And that doesn't make me foolish. It makes me human. This clarity doesn't erase the pain, but it creates space between you and the story. You begin to see the pattern. You begin to understand that staying in pain wasn't loyalty. It was self-abandonment. That holding on wasn't about love. It was about unresolved shame. And you stop waiting. You stop trying to change the ending. You stop trying to fix what was broken with more of yourself. And you begin, slowly, to return to yourself, to the part of you that was always worthy of more than they could give, to the part of you that learned, wrongly, that love meant endurance. And in that return, you discover that letting go isn't about closing the door on someone else. It's about opening the door back to yourself. You don't have to hate them. You don't have to forgive them. You don't have to make sense of what happened. You just have to choose something different now. Because holding on didn't keep you safe. It kept you stuck. And letting go is not weakness. It's repair. Why you struggle to believe you're a good person. Some doubts are loud. Others are quiet, persistent, and woven into the way you speak, act, and see yourself. There's one in particular that many people never say aloud. Not because it's rare, but because it feels shameful to even admit. What if I'm not a good person? It's not always a thought. Sometimes it's a feeling. A subtle discomfort when someone calls you kind. A sense of disconnect when you're praised. An uneasiness in relationships. Like you're being mistaken for someone more worthy than you feel you are. You don't know exactly why, but something inside tells you not to trust positive reflections of yourself. If you live with chronic self-hate, this is one of its quietest and most corrosive effects, the inability to absorb moral worth. You may follow the rules, care about others, try to do the right thing, but something in you resists the idea that you're fundamentally good, that you're someone others can trust, that you're emotionally safe, that you're decent, that you deserve forgiveness, that you belong. This isn't always tied to specific actions or events. Sometimes, it grows out of a long period of being treated in ways that made you feel defective. If you were constantly corrected, blamed, compared, criticized, or overlooked, especially in formative years. You may have absorbed the idea that you were inherently wrong. Not that you did wrong, that you were wrong. The distinction is everything. People who feel inherently wrong often develop a habit of moral overcompensation. They try to be extremely polite, generous, helpful, emotionally careful. They become fixated on being perceived as nice or good, not because they believe it, but because they're afraid of what might happen if others see what's underneath. This fear of being found out becomes exhausting. It creates tension in the way you exist around others. You second-guess your intentions. You question your tone. You replay conversations, looking for signs that you were rude, insensitive, selfish. You start to believe that your goodness depends on how others feel about you at any given moment, and so you chase their approval. You become emotionally attuned to their moods. You change your behavior to keep the peace. You apologize when you're not at fault, not because you enjoy being passive, but because your self-image depends on never making anyone uncomfortable. This doesn't come from ego. It comes from fear. Because if someone tells you you're unkind, ungrateful, selfish, or difficult, you won't just feel corrected, you'll feel exposed, as if they've confirmed what you suspected all along. And that's the real weight of this experience. You live your life trying to avoid confirmation of something you already believe. This belief, I'm not a good person, is not a rational conclusion. It's a conclusion built on emotional evidence. Early emotional experiences where love was withdrawn after mistakes, where feelings were criticized, where effort was ignored, where others defined your value before you could. You internalized a version of yourself that you never consented to. And now, even when you try to challenge it, your mind resists. It says, you've done things you're not proud of. You've hurt people. You're selfish sometimes. You don't always get it right. And all of those things are true for everyone. But self-hate turns those facts into identity. Instead of saying, I acted poorly, you say, I am bad. Instead of, I made a mistake, you say, I am a mistake. This is not just semantics. It shapes everything. Because when you believe you're morally defective, you don't allow yourself the same grace you'd offer others. You don't see your past in context. You don't see your growth. You don't recognize your intentions. You erase the complexity of your own story. You flatten yourself into guilt. And that guilt becomes the lens through which you interpret even your best moments. You do something kind and immediately wonder if it was performative. You help someone and doubt your motives. You feel love and question whether you deserve it, because you've been trained to suspect yourself. That suspicion is not your fault. It's a symptom. It's a symptom of growing up in a world that didn't reflect your worth accurately. A world that made your value conditional. A world that responded to your efforts with silence or critique, instead of affirmation and care. And once that pattern is established, it doesn't go away just because you grow up. It follows you, even into adulthood, even into new relationships, even into therapy or healing. The doubt lingers. What if I'm just a good actor? What if I'm fooling people? What if they knew the real me? So how do you begin to untangle this? You start by pausing when the doubt appears. You don't fight it. You observe it. You say, that voice is here again, the one that tells me I'm not a good person. And you name it for what it is, an old defense system, a set of messages you inherited, not because they were true, but because they were repeated. Then, you ask different questions. What evidence do I have that I care about others? What moments have I acted in alignment with my values? When have I shown kindness, even when no one was watching? What harm have I repaired, even when I didn't have to? What choices have I made, not out of fear, but out of integrity? These questions don't erase guilt. They expand your view. They allow complexity. They let you see that being a good person doesn't mean never doing harm. It means being willing to see it, feel it, and repair it. And slowly, you begin to unlearn the belief that you are fundamentally bad. not by replacing it with a hollow affirmation, but by recognizing that goodness is not something you wait to be awarded. It's something you practice, something you reclaim, something you deserve to recognize in yourself, not because you're perfect, but because you're trying, and trying matters. Why you sabotage what you want the most. There's a strange pattern that plays out quietly in the lives of many people who live with self-hate. It's not loud or obvious. It doesn't always look like crisis. Often, it looks like delay, hesitation, withdrawal, or inaction. You move toward something you want, something good, something meaningful, and just before you get close, you pull back. You cancel the meeting. You stop replying. You miss the deadline. You lose momentum. And on the surface, you say it was stress, or timing, or burnout. But underneath, something deeper is happening. This is self-sabotage, not as failure, but as psychological defense. It's easy to misunderstand this. Most people assume sabotage is a sign of laziness or fear of hard work. But that's not what's going on here. When you live with self-hate, success feels dangerous. Not because you don't want it, but because it directly contradicts how you see yourself. The self-hating mind is built on an internal logic. You are not enough. That idea becomes the foundation for your identity. Everything you do is filtered through it. So when you start to achieve something, or someone values you, or something important goes well, your internal system detects a mismatch. The event says, you're capable. The system says, that doesn't add up. And the system fights to stay intact. You begin doubting. You overthink. You procrastinate. You invent problems. You seek ways to reduce the pressure, because the success itself has become a threat to your psychological equilibrium. The logic is simple. If you're used to feeling unworthy, then any evidence of your worth is destabilizing. So you unconsciously restore the balance, not by thriving, but by pulling yourself back into what feels familiar, struggle. This is not a conscious decision. It's a form of emotional regulation. The mind prefers consistency over growth. So even though you want change, better work, better relationships, better habits, your deeper belief tells you, people like me don't get those things. And that belief guides your behavior. You hesitate before sending the application. You reject affection. You dismiss compliments. You stay quiet when you have something to say. You delay decisions. Not because you don't care, but because your mind is trying to prevent you from entering a space you don't believe you belong in. That's what makes this form of sabotage so painful. You're not failing from lack of effort. You're failing from misalignment. Your external goals don't match your internal story. And as long as that story stays untouched, you'll keep finding ways to make sure your outcomes match your expectations. Sometimes, the sabotage is subtle. You overprepare. You try to make things perfect. You exhaust yourself trying to meet impossible standards, and then burn out. Other times, it's impulsive. You say something you don't mean. You start a conflict. You abandon the plan right before it works. And then the cycle restarts. You feel shame. You call yourself lazy. You tell yourself you can't follow through. And that shame becomes the next proof point in the story that you've believed all along. I always mess things up. But here's the deeper truth. The sabotage didn't start with failure. It started with identity. If you were treated like your value was conditional, if you were only praised when you performed, only loved when you were helpful, only noticed when you were quiet, you learned that your core self wasn't enough. So now, when life presents you with opportunities to thrive as you are, the emotional memory speaks. Don't trust this. It's not real. Or if it is, it won't last. Or if it does, it won't belong to you. This narrative becomes so ingrained that you start to plan for the fall before you even take the step. That's why progress feels unsafe. Not because it is, but because your system is wired to avoid the emotional pain of disillusionment. It would rather prevent good things from happening than risk losing them later. And so you become the one to end things before they begin. You leave before you're left. You fail before you're judged. You disappear before you're rejected. It feels like control, but it's actually self-abandonment. And it's exhausting, because part of you knows what you want. You can see it. You reach for it. You build towards it. And then something in you says, not yet. Not you. Not now. That voice isn't your intuition. It's a survival voice. A voice that was built in an environment where safety came from staying small, unnoticed, out of the way. And that voice won't disappear overnight, but it can be questioned. Every time you feel yourself pulling back, ask, what am I protecting myself from? Is it judgment? Is it failure? Or is it the discomfort of believing that maybe, just maybe, you're allowed to want what you want? This is where healing begins, not with ambition, but with self-permission. The permission to want without shame, to try without apology, to fail without identity collapse, to succeed without sabotage. And that begins with recognizing sabotage for what it is, not a character flaw, but a protective pattern. A pattern you didn't choose, but one you've been living under. And patterns can be rewritten. You won't feel confident right away. You won't always follow through. You'll doubt yourself. But each time you choose action over avoidance, each time you step forward when you want to retreat, you create a break in the loop. And over time, the story changes, not with force, but with consistency. You begin to believe, not in perfection, not in guarantees, but in the possibility that you're allowed to have a life that fits you, a life that reflects your effort, your growth, your truth, and you stop pulling away, not because it's easy, but because you've stopped confusing sabotage with safety. Why you feel responsible for everyone's emotions. There's a quiet exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring how everyone around you feels. You walk into a room, and before you speak, you've already scanned the energy. You're already adjusting your words, your tone, even your facial expression, to make sure no one feels uncomfortable. You listen more than you speak. You help without being asked. You anticipate needs before they're named. To outsiders, it looks like you're simply kind, considerate, thoughtful. But inside, there's tension, fatigue, pressure. Because your empathy isn't just care, it's a form of self-regulation. You're not just trying to make others feel better. You're trying to stay safe. This is one of the most invisible symptoms of long-term self-hate. The belief that you are somehow responsible for the emotional state of everyone around you. It doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from conditioning. If you spent years being told, directly or indirectly, that other people's anger, sadness, or disappointment was your fault, or your job to fix, you started to equate emotional control with emotional safety. As a child, if you felt that conflict was dangerous, if peace in your home depended on your behavior, if your parents' mood determined the atmosphere, then you learned to make yourself emotionally useful. You became the stabilizer, the soother, the fixer. You learned to notice the earliest signs of discomfort in others and rush to resolve them. Not because you were asked to, but because you were emotionally trained to survive that way. And now, even in relationships where no one is demanding that of you, the pattern continues. You apologize when someone else is upset, even if it has nothing to do with you. You replay conversations to see if you could have phrased something better. You worry that your silence will be misinterpreted. You fear that your boundaries might make someone else feel unloved. You manage your presence like a thermostat, constantly adjusting so no one else has to. But in doing so, you lose yourself. Because when you treat other people's emotions as your responsibility, your own emotions become a liability. You suppress your discomfort so you can hold theirs. You don't share your stress because someone else might feel burdened. You don't express your needs because you assume they're already too much. And so your needs don't just go unmet. They go unnamed. You stop recognizing them entirely. You become so externally focused that your inner world becomes quiet, flat. Not because there's nothing there, but because you've been trained to believe that your feelings must wait. That's where the resentment builds. Quietly, slowly, you start to feel unappreciated, unseen, taken for granted. But you blame yourself for that too. You think, I should be more patient. I should be more understanding. I shouldn't need this much. You forget that your needs were never unreasonable. They were just postponed too often. This emotional caretaking becomes a form of identity. You come to define yourself as the person who holds space, who keeps peace, who can always be relied on. And even though that image brings validation, it also traps you, because it leaves no room for you to fall apart. And here's where self-hate thrives, in the false belief that your value lies in your ability to suppress your own emotions for the sake of others. But emotional sacrifice is not love. It's self-neglect disguised as virtue, and it's unsustainable. So what happens when you finally reach your limit? Usually, nothing dramatic. You don't explode. You don't blame. You don't demand. You simply withdraw. You disappear a little. You become less responsive, less available. And then you feel guilt for that too. Because rest, to someone who believes their job is to hold everyone else together, feels like abandonment. And that guilt pulls you right back into the pattern. This is the cycle. Feel tension overextend, suppress your needs, burn out, withdraw, feel guilty, re-engage too quickly, repeat. It doesn't stop until the original belief is questioned. Are you really responsible for how others feel? Not their behavior, not your impact, just their feelings. Can you truly control whether someone else feels disappointed, irritated, or misunderstood? The answer, of course, is no. But emotionally, that answer doesn't feel true, because your nervous system was trained to see emotional disruption as danger. So now, when someone else is upset, even slightly, your body responds with urgency, anxiety, shame, an impulse to fix. And that's the work, not to deny empathy, but to unlearn responsibility. You are allowed to care without carrying, to witness without rescuing, to love without absorbing. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you free, because your job is not to manage everyone's mood. Your job is to be honest, present, and responsible for your side of the relationship. That means setting limits. That means expressing your own needs. That means allowing other people to sit with their own feelings, even when it's uncomfortable for you. Especially then, because discomfort is not damage. It's just part of life. And if you can allow others to feel what they feel, without rushing to soothe it, you begin to create room for your own emotions too. And slowly, the pressure lifts. You begin to notice what you feel, even when no one else is in the room. You begin to say no without a long explanation. You begin to rest without apology. You begin to let others be responsible for their own internal world. And in doing so, you return to yours. Not selfishly, not cruelly, but honestly, because your worth was never tied to how well you manage other people's feelings. It was always tied to how fully you are able to be present in your own. Why you always feel like you're doing life wrong. There's a quiet, persistent feeling that follows some people through every stage of their life. It isn't panic or crisis. It's something smaller and more constant, like background noise. A dull but sharp sense that whatever you're doing, you should be doing it differently. That somewhere, somehow, you're falling behind. That you've missed a memo everyone else seems to have read. You get a job, and you feel behind. You start a conversation, and you second-guess every sentence. You try to rest, and you feel guilty. You try to be productive, and you feel you're not doing enough. Even when things are going well, there's a voice that says, you should be further by now, better by now, smarter by now, calmer by now. This feeling isn't laziness or lack of ambition. It's a symptom of something deeper, the belief that your life, as it is, doesn't measure up, and that you, as a person, never quite get it right. That belief is one of the most invisible consequences of long-term self-hate. It starts early, often in subtle ways. If you grew up being compared to others, or held to standards you didn't understand, or corrected more than guided, or constantly reminded of what you could be instead of what you already were, you began to internalize a quiet message: you're always slightly off. It may not have been said directly, but it was shown through impatience, through microcritiques, through praise that only came after perfection, through silence when you needed warmth, through small moments that taught you to be constantly on edge, always trying to get it right. That emotional posture doesn't go away. It becomes the lens through which you experience adulthood. You hesitate before speaking up in meetings, not because you don't have thoughts, but because you assume they aren't fully formed yet. You ask for help less than you should, not because you don't need it, but because you assume you should know already. You don't celebrate milestones, not because they don't matter, but because you believe they don't count unless they look a certain way. You live with an invisible standard that keeps shifting, just out of reach, a constant pressure to adjust, to improve, to explain yourself, and it never feels like enough. This experience isn't just emotional, it's cognitive. The brain, trained in constant self-monitoring, begins to automatically search for what's missing. What could go wrong? What doesn't quite fit? You walk into a room and assume you're overdressed or underdressed. You speak and immediately wonder if you were too much or not enough. You rest and feel lazy. You work and feel inefficient. You smile and feel fake. You frown and feel rude. Every action feels like a small misstep. And the problem is not the situation, it's the lens. The lens that was built out of years of never feeling aligned. Never feeling quite welcomed into the space without editing some part of yourself. Never feeling like your timing, your pace, your version of life was quite acceptable. This creates a baseline of low-level shame. Not explosive guilt, just a steady sense of being wrong. Not wrong in action, wrong in being. And here's the painful part. The more you try to fix it, the worse it gets. You read more books. You organize your day. You try different productivity systems. You rehearse conversations in your head. You try harder. You delay joy until later. But none of it lands. Because the part of you that feels behind isn't looking for practical solutions. It's looking for permission to be as you are. And that's the one thing the self-hating mind doesn't allow. It treats rest as laziness, joy as undeserved, struggle as failure, and success as temporary luck. So you move through life trying to catch up to an imagined version of yourself, one that always feels 2 steps ahead, a version of you that's calmer, smarter, more successful, more liked, and you never catch up, because that version was built by comparison, by perfectionism, by shame. It doesn't actually exist. And the more you chase it, the more disconnected you become from your real self, the one who exists in the present, with needs, limits, contradictions, and value right now. So how do you step out of this? Not by achieving more, not by changing everything, but by challenging the baseline assumption that your life is unfolding incorrectly. What if there is no right timeline? What if you haven't missed anything? What if your pace is valid? What if discomfort doesn't mean failure, but transition? These are not just comforting thoughts. They are psychological corrections to a system built on distortion. Because the belief that you're doing life wrong isn't an insight. It's a wound that formed when you weren't mirrored accurately, when your way of being wasn't reflected back as acceptable, when your pace wasn't supported, when your feelings were met with indifference or correction instead of curiosity and care. And that wound can only begin to heal when you start offering yourself what was missing. Not more discipline, more understanding, not more pressure, more permission, to speak with pauses, to change directions, to question what success even means to you, to grow in ways that aren't linear, to exist without constant self-assessment. This doesn't mean giving up on growth. It means finally letting growth include you, as you are, not just the version you hope to become. And slowly, The background noise softens. The urgency fades. You stop looking sideways to compare. You stop looking ahead in fear. You start inhabiting where you are. And you realize, maybe you weren't doing it wrong. Maybe you were just doing it while believing you had to be someone else. Why you can't accept peace without feeling uneasy. For some people, peace is not relaxing. It's not comforting. It's unsettling. A quiet day feels suspicious. A healthy relationship feels unreal. A calm body feels like the warning before something breaks. You can be sitting in a peaceful room, with nothing urgent to handle, no threats in sight, and still feel your muscles tensing, your thoughts circling, your chest tight. It's not the absence of chaos that soothes you. It's chaos that feels familiar. And that familiarity becomes a form of emotional safety, even when it's painful. This is one of the least recognized effects of long-term self-hate, the deep discomfort with being okay. You may not realize it. On the surface, you might say you want peace. You want a stable life, a calm mind, a loving connection. But when you actually find yourself in a situation that offers those things, something feels off. You get anxious, restless, distracted. You find small things to worry about. You provoke conflict, or overthink, or isolate. You tell yourself you're just bored, or you're finally processing stress. But beneath it is a more honest reaction. Peace feels wrong. To understand this, you have to go back to how your nervous system was trained. If you were raised in an environment that was unpredictable, emotionally chaotic, or full of unspoken tension, your system adapted. You learned to stay alert, hyper-aware, attuned to changes in tone, in silence, in body language. You learned how to preempt emotional shifts, how to prepare for disappointment, how to survive discomfort before it arrived. Your baseline became vigilance, and that vigilance was mistaken for personality. You were called observant, intense, anxious, sensitive, but those were survival traits, necessary skills to function in a space where stillness could turn sharp without warning. So when you now enter a space that's actually calm, where no one is angry, where nothing needs fixing, your system doesn't relax. It scans. It waits. It questions. It says, something must be wrong. I just can't see it yet. This suspicion of peace is not irrational. It's trained. If you grew up associating calm with the moment before someone exploded, or the silence that came after a conflict, then peace was never peace. It was the warning signal. And that's what your body remembers, even when your mind forgets. So now, when you're in a situation that's genuinely stable, your body still reacts to old patterns. You don't trust it. You don't know what to do with it. And most of all, you feel like you don't deserve it. That's where self-hate enters. Because if you've spent years believing you are flawed, broken, undeserving, then peace feels incompatible with your identity. You begin to interpret comfort as false. Safety is temporary. Love is accidental. You think, this is too easy. They must not know the real me. This won't last. I'm not built for this. And so you sabotage it, not to hurt yourself, but to return to something familiar, something emotionally recognizable. Chaos may hurt, but at least it makes sense. Peace doesn't, because peace requires acceptance. And acceptance is something the self-hating mind can't offer. It rejects stillness. It calls calm unearned. It searches for disruption, not because it wants pain, but because it wants coherence. A calm life doesn't match a self-punishing identity, so the identity wins. Until it doesn't. Because here's the turning point: peace, like pain, can be learned. But it takes time. You don't jump into peace and feel relief. You step into it gradually. You learn how to let it sit. At first, it will feel foreign. It will trigger all the alarms. But that's not a sign to leave. It's a sign to stay, to breathe, to observe your discomfort, not as a truth, but as a habit. You tell yourself, this isn't wrong. It's new. And in that reframing, the work begins. You allow yourself to experience calm without justifying it. You allow love without testing it. You allow safety without searching for escape. You allow good things without planning for them to end. And every time you do that, your nervous system shifts. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly. You begin to realize that peace doesn't mean you've stopped growing. It means you've started healing, that you don't have to earn rest with suffering. That comfort isn't weakness. That not everything must be fixed before you're allowed to feel okay. This is hard, because part of you will always want to return to the noise. But the more you notice that pattern, the less power it has. You begin to recognize the urge to create problems when none exist, to start conflict when things get too close, to distance yourself when you feel safe, to rehearse old pain instead of practicing present trust. And in that recognition, you regain choice. You can pause. You can stay. You can begin to teach your body that peace is not the enemy. It's the absence of one. And slowly, you'll stop mistaking silence for danger. You'll stop mistaking calm for failure. You'll stop mistaking safety for boredom. And you'll start to believe quietly, without ceremony, that maybe peace was never the problem. It was just something no one ever taught you how to live with. Why you struggle to feel proud of yourself. There's something quietly painful about not being able to feel proud of yourself. You do what's expected. Sometimes you do more. You try. You show up. You handle things others don't even see. But when it comes time to acknowledge yourself, to actually feel good about what you've done, something stops you. You brush it off. You say, "It wasn't that hard." You minimize. You joke. You immediately think of what's next. Or worse, you think about what you didn't do. What could have been done better? What still isn't enough? This is not modesty. It's not humility. It's something deeper. A learned refusal to see your own worth. A discomfort with internal recognition. A lifelong habit of filtering your accomplishments through shame. If you live with self-hate, pride doesn't feel natural. It feels like a lie. That's because somewhere along the way, you were taught, directly or indirectly, that you were not supposed to feel good about yourself. That pride was dangerous. That celebration was arrogance. That being satisfied meant you were lazy. That recognition was only for people who had done something extraordinary. And even then, only briefly. And so now, when something goes well, when you accomplish something real, or even just survive something difficult, you hesitate. You feel the impulse to honor it, and then you shut it down. Why? Because pride challenges your internal identity. The part of you that believes you're fundamentally flawed. The version of yourself that's been built on criticism, comparison, and emotional debt. That version can't allow pride. Because pride disrupts the story. The story that says you're always slightly behind. That you could have done better. That you're only as good as your next result. That your value is conditional. And pride is unconditional. It says, "This was hard, and I did it. This matters, even if no one sees it. I showed up when I didn't want to. I did the best I could with what I had. I didn't quit." But if you were raised to associate pride with being punished, ignored, or misunderstood, then even those statements feel risky. So instead, you keep your head down. You do more. You stay in motion. You collect achievements, but don't absorb them. You become high-functioning, but emotionally numb. Because pride isn't a public thing. It's not about applause. It's about recognition from yourself. And when you've spent your life convincing yourself that you are undeserving, recognition becomes threatening. You'll say it's just not a big deal. You'll say it was luck. You'll say anyone could have done it. You'll say you don't want attention. But deep down, you might feel something else. That if you allowed yourself to feel proud, you might finally have to admit how much you've been carrying, how hard you've been trying, how long you've been waiting to be seen. And admitting that opens a floodgate of feelings that self-hate works hard to keep locked. Pride connects you to your own effort. And effort, when acknowledged, often leads to grief. because then you realize no one else ever really recognized what you've been through. And so, to avoid that grief, you stay quiet. You act like it's nothing. But it's not nothing. It's the years of silence, the moments you pushed through, the pain you held without breaking, the loneliness of doing it all while wondering if it even counts. And that's why this kind of pride matters. Not the pride of ego, the pride of survival, of resilience, of finally saying to yourself, I did that. I was there. I stayed. I tried. It's not about perfection. It's not about success in someone else's terms. It's about honesty. And that honesty starts with small acknowledgments. You pause before brushing something off. You name what you did. You let yourself feel it, even for a second. You stop the thought that says, it wasn't enough. You replace it with, it was something, and I was there for it. That's how pride grows in someone who wasn't allowed to feel it. Not in grand speeches, in quiet reconnection. And with time, that connection deepens. You begin to look at your past not as a series of failures, but as proof of your strength. You see the version of yourself who kept going, not perfectly, not painlessly, but consistently. And you realize the story wasn't that you weren't enough. The story was that no one told you you already were. Pride, then, becomes not an act of arrogance, but of healing. You begin to restore something that was taken early. You give yourself what you once waited for. And slowly, quietly, it starts to feel true. Not loud, just real. Why you expect others to leave, even when they don't. There's a feeling that never fully leaves when you live with long-standing self-hate. It doesn't matter how kind someone is, or how long they've stayed, or how many times they've reassured you. Deep down, some part of you still waits for it to end. The friendship, the relationship, the support, the closeness. You don't know exactly when or how. You just feel that it will happen, that it's only a matter of time. This isn't paranoia, and it's not about trust in others. Not really. It's about the absence of trust in yourself, as someone who's worth staying for. You may call yourself sensitive, or say you just have abandonment issues. But that phrase doesn't quite hold the weight of what's really happening. What's really happening is a constant emotional rehearsal for the moment people pull away. A quiet preparation for loss. Even when nothing is going wrong. Even when love is present. Even when there's no actual threat. You carry a low-grade expectation of departure. That expectation isn't irrational. It's learned. If you were emotionally neglected, if people were inconsistent, or hot and cold, or conditional with their care, then your nervous system adapted. You didn't learn to feel safe when people showed up. You learned to be cautious, to wait, to scan for signs, because you had seen before how quickly warmth could turn cold, or how affection could vanish after a mistake. And now, even in safer relationships, that memory stays active. You might not act on it, but you feel it. You hesitate before sharing too much. You check in more than you need to. You apologize quickly, even when you're not sure why. You explain yourself in conversations where no explanation is required. You watch how people text, how long they take to respond, what tone they use. You monitor distance. And when someone pulls back, even just a little, you don't think, they're having a bad day. You think, here it comes. The ending. The withdrawal. The confirmation of what you've always believed about yourself. That you are easy to leave. This belief is painful not just because it hurts, but because it seems to repeat itself. You begin to see patterns. People drift. Things change. You experience loss. And it all starts to look like proof. Proof that you were right to be cautious. But what if that's not proof? What if part of the pattern is being shaped by the very expectation? Here's how that happens. When you believe someone will leave you, your behavior shifts. Not maliciously, not dramatically, but subtly. You test. You pull back first. You over-accommodate. You underexpress. You don't show up fully, because you expect they won't either. And what begins as protection becomes prophecy. Not because you were wrong about your worth, but because you never gave yourself permission to act like someone who deserved to be chosen and kept. That's the trap. Your self-hate creates a script, and you live inside it. You don't believe anyone can stay. So you stop behaving like someone worth staying for. You don't ask for what you need. You don't express when you're hurt. You don't allow closeness. You become careful, and eventually, distant. And distance makes people feel disconnected. And disconnection leads to exactly what you feared, detachment. But that outcome doesn't mean you were unworthy. It means you were living out a strategy designed to avoid pain. And it worked for a while. It protected you from being blindsided, from being vulnerable, from being left without warning. But it also protected you from being fully seen, fully known, fully loved. Because the parts of you that believed no one would stay never gave anyone the chance to prove otherwise. And that's where the possibility of healing begins. Not in forcing yourself to trust everyone, but in becoming aware of how often you preempt loss. In noticing when you hold back, not because it feels right, but because you're scared of the alternative. In asking, what would I do here if I believed they weren't going anywhere? That question changes the conversation. It invites you to act from the present instead of the past, to show up without hedging, to speak without apology, to trust without test. That doesn't mean being naive. It means allowing the relationship to breathe. Because when you stop preparing for loss, something else can emerge. Not perfect security, but a new kind of quiet. A space where love isn't a countdown, where connection isn't a performance, where you are allowed to stay fully, visibly, without preparing to be left. And that space, once created, begins to change the script. Slowly, the expectation softens, not because you've forced yourself to trust everyone, but because you've started to trust that even if someone does leave, it won't be proof that you were unworthy. It will be proof that people leave, and that doesn't define you. And in that realization, the self-hate loses one of its strongest anchors. Because you stop equating departure with defect. You stop confusing absence with exposure. And you begin to see relationships not as tests to pass, but as places you're allowed to exist in, without earning, without performing, without shrinking, without waiting for it all to end. Why you think people are being nice out of pity? There's a specific discomfort that many people never talk about. Not because it's rare, but because it's hard to explain. It's the discomfort of being treated kindly, of being complimented, of being spoken to with warmth. You smile. You say thank you. You nod along. But inside, you feel uneasy. You question it. You wonder what the person wants. You think maybe they're just being polite. Or worse, you assume they feel sorry for you. This is not insecurity in the surface-level sense. It's not about craving more compliments or being unsure how to take them. It's deeper than that. It's the result of an internal belief that says, if someone is being nice to me, it's not because I deserve it. It's because they feel bad for me. That belief doesn't show up out of nowhere. It comes from a long history of emotional misattunement. If you were raised in an environment where genuine praise was rare, or given with mixed signals, where kindness felt conditional, insincere, or performative, your emotional system learned a dangerous lesson. Attention is a signal of obligation, not affection. So when someone now sees you, chooses you, or speaks kindly to you, your first instinct is not gratitude, it's suspicion. You begin scanning the moment. You listen for inconsistencies. You search for signs. Your brain reinterprets the compliment through a filter of doubt. They don't mean it. They're just trying to be nice. They're trying to keep the peace. They feel bad for me. They're uncomfortable and want the moment to pass. This response is not irrational. It's a learned defense. It protects you from emotional exposure. Because believing that someone genuinely values you would mean opening yourself to something your self-hate can't tolerate. The possibility that you are worth kindness without earning it. And that idea threatens the foundation of how you've come to understand yourself. People who live with chronic self-hate often develop an identity around being useful, productive, invisible, agreeable, or strong, but rarely around being inherently worthy of affection. So when kindness arrives without a reason, without effort or achievement, your system goes into alert. It says, "This doesn't match who I am, so it has to be something else." Pity, politeness, a mistake. And just like that, the moment of warmth becomes emotionally destabilizing. This reaction doesn't just affect compliments. It affects relationships. When someone shows consistent care for you, you struggle to receive it. You worry they don't see the full picture. That if they knew the real you, they'd pull away. That they're just being generous out of obligation, or guilt, or because they don't want to hurt your feelings. You never feel chosen. You feel tolerated. And over time, that misreading of kindness becomes a filter you can't turn off. You start assuming people are lying, nicely, that they're being emotionally diplomatic, that they're sparing your feelings. This isn't just exhausting, it's isolating. Because even when people show up for you, you don't let it in. You don't trust the affection. You don't feel it as care. You translate it into performance, something they're doing for you, not with you. And that reinforces the original belief. People are only nice to me because they have to be. So how do you shift this? Not by forcing yourself to believe compliments. Not by trying to silence your doubts. But by beginning to understand where the reflex comes from. Ask yourself, when did you first learn that kindness wasn't real? Was it a parent who said, "I love you," but never made you feel safe? A teacher who praised your work, but shamed your mistakes? Friends who included you out of politeness, but never invited you in emotionally? These early inconsistencies train the brain to distrust kindness. And that training doesn't vanish on its own. It needs to be challenged, gently. You begin by noticing the moment the reflex appears. Someone is nice to you. You feel discomfort. Your mind starts spinning stories. You pause. You ask, what if this moment is real? Not definitely real. Not certainly permanent. Just possible. What if this person is being kind because they want to? What if you don't have to earn it? What if this isn't about you being pitiful, but about them being present? That shift doesn't change your body overnight, but it creates space. Space where the old script doesn't dominate. And in that space, you can begin to let some warmth in. Not all of it, just enough to feel the contrast. To feel what it's like when kindness isn't tied to performance. When affection isn't preceded by apology. When love isn't hidden under pity. And slowly, you realize, maybe kindness is not always a trick. Maybe it's just connection. And maybe the people who show it don't feel sorry for you. Maybe they simply see you, and they still stay. That possibility can't be proven with logic. It has to be lived, felt, let in, one moment at a time. Why you struggle to believe you're missed. There's a specific kind of emptiness that isn't about being alone. It's about not knowing if your absence matters. About wondering if your presence makes any real difference. You leave a room, and no one says much. You take a break from a group chat, and it goes quiet. You don't hear back from someone, and instead of assuming they're busy, you assume you weren't that important in the first place. It's not about being ignored outright. It's the deeper feeling that if you disappeared quietly, the world would adjust without hesitation. This belief doesn't form overnight. It comes from long exposure to subtle but consistent emotional neglect, the kind that doesn't wound loudly, but erodes slowly. If you were never celebrated for just being yourself, if people only acknowledged you when you were useful or agreeable, if your emotions were often overlooked, if your quietness was treated as invisibility, then it's likely that a part of you began to equate presence with burden and absence with relief. You learn that people are fine without you. And now, even when people care about you, even when they say it, even when they try to show up, you don't really trust it. You don't believe that your absence creates a gap. You might even downplay it. You tell yourself, they're better off without me. They probably didn't notice. It's okay. I don't want to be a burden anyway. And you pull away. But the pulling away isn't indifference. It's a defense mechanism, a way of protecting yourself from the possibility that you're right, that no one notices, that no one misses you. Because admitting that you want to be missed feels risky. It feels like asking for validation you don't believe you deserve. So you make peace with invisibility. You tell yourself it's better not to expect anything. But expectations don't disappear. They just hide. You notice when people don't check in. You keep mental tabs on who reaches out. You feel a quiet hurt when no one notices your silence. But instead of expressing it, you internalize it. You say, of course they didn't notice. I'm forgettable. That conclusion isn't true. It's familiar. And familiar feels safe, even when it's painful. That's how self-hate works. It doesn't just attack your strengths. It reshapes your understanding of connection. It tells you that people tolerate you, that they enjoy your presence only when it's convenient, that your role is to support, not to be seen. And so, when people do try to connect, you don't absorb it. You brush it off. You say, I appreciate it, but you don't feel it in your body. You don't let it shift the narrative, because the narrative is built too deep. It says, you are not the kind of person who gets missed. And when that belief lives inside you long enough, you start behaving as if it's fact. You isolate faster. You downplay your presence. You don't initiate contact, not because you don't care, but because you assume it won't matter. And when relationships fade, you don't fight it. You don't ask what happened. You don't express the pain. You just accept it as confirmation of what you believed all along. But this is not acceptance. It's resignation. And it's based on an old emotional equation that needs to be challenged. Ask yourself, where did you learn that your presence was optional? Who made you feel like you were easy to live without? What did they do, or fail to do, that made you draw the conclusion that your needs, your energy, your absence didn't impact anyone? Because somewhere along the way, someone failed to notice you, and your mind turned that into identity. It said, I am the kind of person who isn't noticed. But that conclusion, once formed, doesn't have to become permanent, because absence does matter. But you won't feel that truth until you begin acting like someone whose presence should matter. That means reaching out without apologizing, saying what you feel without minimizing it, naming your disappointment without spinning it into guilt. It means recognizing that people can care about you and be imperfect at showing it. That your fear of being forgotten isn't proof that you're forgettable. That the silence you hear from others isn't always a reflection of your worth, but sometimes a reflection of theirs. And even when it is a reflection of their disinterest, it still doesn't define you. Because how others respond, or fail to, doesn't decide the value of your presence. You do, and you're allowed to want to be missed. That one is not weak. It's human. And the more you own it, the more you say, I hope they thought of me. I hope they missed me. The more space you create for actual connection. Because vulnerability isn't in pretending you don't care. It's in showing up like you do. And eventually, someone will notice. Someone will say, I missed you. And you'll hesitate. You'll want to reject it. But don't. Let it land. Let it sit. Let it begin to challenge the oldest belief you carry, that you are easy to forget. Because the truth is, you never were. Why you believe people only like the version of you that isn't real. There's a type of emotional exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from constantly managing how you're perceived. You smile a little more than you feel. You agree a little more than you want to. You hold back thoughts you know are valid. You shape your sentences carefully. You become emotionally readable, safe, pleasant, even when inside. You feel different. And when people say they like you, you hear it, but it doesn't feel real. Because they don't know the full you. They like the version of you you've curated. The one you've kept within the lines. The one who doesn't interrupt, doesn't complain, doesn't make things uncomfortable. The one who knows how to sound okay, even when they're not. So when people show affection, support, or admiration, you don't absorb it. You tell yourself, they like who I'm pretending to be. This doesn't mean you're fake. It means you've adapted. If you grew up in a space where authenticity led to conflict, dismissal, or rejection, you learn to modulate yourself. Not to manipulate, but to survive. You studied how to behave, how to respond, how to adjust your emotions based on the room. You didn't learn to feel safe being real. You learned to feel safe being palatable. And that emotional strategy, while effective in the short term, builds an identity that feels detached from your actual self. So as an adult, even in healthy relationships, you feel emotionally disconnected. Not because others don't care, but because you're not convinced they're caring about the real you. You say what people want to hear, then wonder why no one knows you deeply. You give what's expected, then feel resentful when people don't see what's missing. You perform closeness, then feel completely alone. This cycle is common for those who carry deep self-hate, not because they're deceptive, but because they've learned that being fully seen is dangerous. So when connection happens, it feels fragile, conditional, like something that only exists as long as you can keep up the image. And that image, it's exhausting, because you're always editing yourself. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to keep your deeper emotions private. Enough to keep your darker thoughts unspoken. Enough to keep your needs tucked away, hidden under a layer of self-sufficiency. And when people respond to you, you assume it's not really you they're responding to. It's the mask. That assumption becomes a core belief. If I were fully myself, they'd leave. That belief isn't obvious. It's quiet, but it guides your decisions. You keep conversations light. You make jokes instead of complaints. You share just enough to seem open, but not enough to feel vulnerable. You manage your expression. You tell yourself you're protecting others, but you're really protecting yourself from the risk of rejection. And the cost is this: you never feel fully chosen, because you never feel fully known. And even when someone says, I care about you, you wonder, would you still care if I let everything out? That's the question at the root of the self-hating identity. Not just am I good enough, but am I safe enough to be fully real? Because being real might mean being angry, being difficult, being disappointed, being opinionated, being inconsistent, being tired, being unsure, being emotional. And those are the parts of you that you were taught to hide. Because when you showed them as a child, or even as an adult, you were punished, ignored, misunderstood, or told to tone it down. So now, you hide first. You show the version that doesn't rock the boat, and you confuse being liked with being seen. But they're not the same. Being liked for your performance feels hollow. Being seen and still accepted, that's connection. So how do you break this? Not by exposing everything at once. Not by dumping your emotions on someone and hoping they stay. But by slowly testing reality against the story your self-hate has built. Start small. Say what you actually think, even if it's different from what you usually say. Reveal a need without apologizing for it. Let a silence linger instead of rushing to fill it. Speak from a place that isn't filtered by your need to be liked. And then, observe what happens. If the other person responds with curiosity, not criticism, stay. If they adjust to the fuller version of you, let that land. If they don't withdraw, let that moment challenge the belief that you're only lovable in edited form. Because real connection doesn't require performance. It requires presence. And presence means showing up as you are, not as who you think they want. This doesn't mean being reckless with your expression. It means being honest without the need to be perfect. And in that honesty, something quiet but powerful begins to happen. You stop treating your personality like a disguise. You stop interpreting kindness as confusion. You stop assuming that visibility is the first step toward loss. And you start feeling something unfamiliar but true. That the real you, the one with edges, needs. And contradictions is not too much. It's just been waiting, waiting to be chosen, not for what you give, but for who you are when you stop hiding. You never ask for reassurance because you assume you don't deserve it. There's a moment that repeats itself often in the lives of people who carry quiet self-hate. It's not dramatic. It's subtle. Someone says they care, that you matter, that you're doing okay. And though you may nod and smile, you don't ask for more, even if you need to hear it again. Even if something inside you feels unsettled or unsure, you don't ask for reassurance. Not because you don't want it, but because you don't believe you're allowed to need it. This pattern isn't just about pride or independence. It's about learned emotional denial. A quiet, persistent belief that seeking clarity or comfort will make you seem weak, demanding, or burdensome. So instead of asking for reassurance, you internalize your doubt. You tell yourself, I should know by now. They already said it once. If I have to ask, it probably means I don't deserve the answer I want. This inner monologue doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from long experience, often formed in relationships where emotional needs were dismissed, minimized, or used against you. If you were told as a child that you were too sensitive, too dramatic, or too much, then asking for comfort didn't feel like connection, it felt like risk. If you ever tried to explain how you felt and were met with irritation, withdrawal, or silence, then expressing need didn't feel safe. It felt exposing. Over time, you adjusted. You stopped expressing. You stopped clarifying. You learned to process uncertainty internally, even if it cost you peace. Now, as an adult, you live with the residue of that pattern. You second-guess your place in people's lives. You overanalyze their tone. You wonder if you've upset them. You feel unsure about what they meant. But you never say it. You never ask. You carry the tension alone. Because somewhere in you, there's a belief that says, if they really cared, I wouldn't have to ask. But the truth is more complicated. People who care don't always know what to say. They don't always notice your hesitation. They may not realize how much reassurance you need. Not because they don't care, but because you're hiding how much it matters. You think asking will push them away. But what actually pushes people away is emotional invisibility. The kind that builds when you don't speak your needs, when you wait for them to guess, when you punish yourself for wanting clarity. This creates a quiet kind of isolation. You're present in relationships, but not emotionally visible. You don't make waves, but you also don't get comfort. And the pain of that is rarely named, because it sounds small. You think, I shouldn't need to hear it again. They already said it last week. It's not fair to keep asking for the same thing, but emotional needs don't expire. Reassurance isn't a one-time transaction. It's part of connection. And the fear of needing too much often hides the truth that you've spent most of your life receiving too little. You grew up rationing comfort. So now, when it's available, you don't reach for it. You flinch. You freeze. You downplay. You pretend you don't need anything, and then quietly resent that no one offers more. This isn't about other people failing you. It's about a system you've built to avoid rejection. But that system is based on old data, on moments when expressing need was dangerous. It's no longer accurate. Now, it's just limiting, and it can be changed. Not overnight, but slowly. You begin by catching the moment when you want to say, can you remind me I'm okay? Or did I upset you? Or, can you just tell me one more time that we're still good? And instead of swallowing it, you say it. Not forcefully, just honestly, softly. You ask, not because you're weak, but because you're allowed to. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable. Your body might tense. You might feel guilt rise. You might want to take it back. But wait, let the moment pass. Let their response arrive. And when it does, and they answer with care, let that answer land. Let it start to rewrite the belief that you have to suffer quietly. You don't. You never did. The need to be reassured doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. And the moment you stop punishing yourself for that, the moment you say the words you've always been afraid to say, you stop waiting for love to be proven in silence. You begin participating in it, fully, with all your fears, all your questions, all your truth. And in that honesty, something shifts. You no longer feel like you're faking security. You no longer measure love by how much discomfort you can tolerate in silence. You let reassurance be what it is, not a flaw, not a failure, but a bridge back to connection. And you walk across it, not ashamed, but whole. You don't feel loved, you feel required. For many people who live with quiet self-hate, love doesn't feel warm. It doesn't feel safe or nourishing. It feels like duty, like something others give out of habit, obligation, routine. You hear the words, you see the actions, but the feeling doesn't land. Instead of thinking, I am loved, you think, they have to. It's a subtle distinction, but it changes everything. When you believe you're required, not chosen, you stop trusting the connection. You stop trusting that people are showing up for you, and start assuming they're doing it out of pressure, out of guilt, out of emotional responsibility, not affection, not desire, not choice. This belief doesn't show up overnight. It forms early, quietly, through experiences where love was inconsistent or offered in transactional terms. If you grew up in a home where caretaking was mechanical, where your needs were met but not emotionally engaged with, you may have started to believe that being cared for was not about you, but about the role you played. You were fed, clothed, helped, but not necessarily known. Or maybe you were praised for doing well, for being easy, for staying quiet. You were acknowledged for being good, not for being you. And now, when someone says, I love you, it feels disconnected, because it feels directed at a version of you that fits their expectation, not the full you that exists beneath the surface. So instead of letting the love in, you begin to measure it. You question it. You analyze tone, frequency, timing. You wonder what it would take for them to stop. You wait for the moment it disappears, so you can say, I knew it. It was never real. This is how self-hate protects itself, by converting affection into evidence of obligation. And that shift makes connection feel hollow. You might still stay in relationships. You might still talk to friends, show up to events, play the role, but emotionally, you're disconnected. Not because you don't care, but because you're not convinced that anyone else really does. You don't feel chosen. You feel maintained, as if your presence is something people uphold because they're supposed to, not because they want to. That belief is reinforced every time someone forgets a detail, cancels plans, gets distracted, or fails to notice your quiet pullback. You take those moments and say, see, it's not real. It's just habit. But the truth is more complicated. It's not that others don't care. It's that you don't allow yourself to feel like the reason they do. Because deep down, you don't believe you are lovable. You believe your usefulness is, your politeness, your help, your silence, your stability, all the parts of you that ask for nothing and give everything. And when you finally do show emotion, when you express frustration, sadness, confusion, you feel like you're breaking a contract that says, I will make this easy if you pretend to care. And when you ask for more, or act less perfect, or admit you're tired, you fear that the illusion will break, that people will finally realize you were never what they wanted. That's the emotional logic of self-hate. It says love is a reward, not a reflection. And if you mess up, you lose it. So instead of risking loss, you accept hollow presence. You settle for being needed because it feels safer than being seen. But here's what's missing. Love is not supposed to feel like management. It's supposed to feel like resonance, like someone is there because of you, not in spite of you. So how do you begin to shift this? You start by noticing the impulse to convert affection into obligation. The next time someone is kind, don't analyze it. Don't look for the reason. Just pause. Let it land, even if it feels off. Let your body hold it, even if your mind says it's undeserved. You begin to speak the truth of what you need, not in desperation, but in honesty. You say, "Sometimes I can't tell if you want to be here, or if you feel like you have to." You say, "I know you show up. I just don't always believe it's because of me." That kind of truth is risky, but it's also the only way to challenge the lie. The lie that says you are loved because you perform, not because you exist. And when someone stays, when someone listens, you let that contradiction breathe. You don't erase the doubt, but you don't let it control the script. You let the possibility exist, that maybe, just maybe, you are not a responsibility. You are a connection. You are not a task. You are a person, not required, but remembered, wanted, chosen. The quiet panic behind being told, "You're so strong." It sounds like a compliment, and sometimes it is. But if you live with deeply rooted self-hate, being told, "You're so strong," doesn't feel like support. It feels like pressure, like warning, like an expectation you didn't agree to carry. You nod. You say thank you. You smile because that's what's expected. But inside, it stings. Because what people call strength in you is often just survival that hasn't been acknowledged. Silence that's been misread. Endurance mistaken for emotional stability. You're told you're strong because you didn't break, but no one saw how close you came. You're told you're strong because you didn't cry, but no one asked why you felt like you couldn't. You're told you're strong because you've been through so much, but no one noticed how little you've said about any of it. This is the paradox. You get praised for being resilient, but no one offers rest. You're admired for how much you can handle, so you stop believing you're allowed to feel overwhelmed. And over time, "You're so strong" starts to feel like another way of saying, "You don't need help." So you stop reaching out. You stop expressing softness. You keep quiet when it's hard. You keep showing up when you should be lying down. Because the moment you do ask for something, the illusion breaks. And if you've built your identity around being strong, then cracking even a little feels like failure. What's worse, when you do finally speak up, people are surprised. They say, "But you seemed fine. You're always so composed. I didn't know it was that bad." And you feel guilty for shattering the image they had of you. This is what chronic self-hate does. It makes you curate a version of yourself that's emotionally clean, easy to support, never too messy. And then it traps you inside that version. You don't perform strength because you want to. You perform it because you think you'll be abandoned if you stop. That's the fear behind the compliment. That if you ever admit you're not okay, no one will know what to do with you. That if you cry, or break, or fall apart, even a little, you'll lose the respect, the trust, the affection you've earned by being so composed. So you keep it in. You nod through grief. You joke through burnout. You reassure others while you silently spiral. Because once people believe you're the strong one, it's hard to remind them you're also the tired one. And here's the danger. Eventually, you start believing it yourself. You internalize the label. You start dismissing your own pain. You start thinking you should be fine. You minimize your symptoms. You compare your suffering to others. You delay care. You wait until the breakdown is too big to hide. And then when it comes, you feel ashamed. Not just for struggling, but for betraying the version of you that kept everything together. This cycle doesn't break by rejecting the compliment. It breaks by redefining strength. Not as endurance, not as silence, not as performance, but as capacity with honesty. Strength is not the absence of need. It's the ability to name your need without shame. It's saying, "I'm capable, and I'm also overwhelmed. I've carried a lot, and I shouldn't have had to. I'm showing up, but not because I'm fine." This redefinition isn't just about language, it's about access. When you allow yourself to be seen as both strong and human, you create space for support. You stop carrying everything alone. You stop waiting for people to notice what you never say. You start reaching out, not as failure, but as maturity. Because true strength doesn't mean always holding it together. It means knowing when you don't have to. When someone calls you strong, you can still accept it, but you get to add to it. You get to say, yes, I've survived, but that doesn't mean I'm okay. You get to say, thank you, but I need to rest. You get to stop pretending that composure equals health. Because the strongest thing you'll ever do is stop proving it and let someone hold you, even if you don't think you've earned it. You don't feel respected, only tolerated. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being around people who say the right words, who include you in plans, who keep you in the loop, but who never really make you feel respected. You're there. You're invited. You're not ignored. But something's missing. What's missing is recognition, not of your presence, but of your value. You notice it in small ways. When your opinions aren't considered seriously. When you speak and people move past it. When others get credit for something you quietly made possible. When decisions are made and you're told after the fact. You aren't excluded, but you're not really factored in either. And over time, that builds a sense of emotional displacement. You start to feel like someone people keep around out of convenience, habit, or politeness, but not because they truly respect what you bring. This experience is common in people who live with self-hate, not because others actively look down on them, but because they've never learned to see themselves as someone who should be respected. You don't fight for space in conversations. You don't push back when dismissed. You don't assert your perspective, not because you lack thoughts, but because deep down, you assume they're not worth defending. You let others lead. You let others interrupt. You nod through disagreement. You stay quiet when things bother you. You support from the background. And when you're overlooked, you tell yourself it's no big deal. But it is. Not because you need to be in charge, but because you need to feel seen as someone who matters. Someone whose presence adds weight, not just convenience. And here's where it gets harder. When people around you notice that you don't assert yourself, they adjust. Not maliciously, but predictably. They stop asking for your input. They stop checking in. They start assuming you're fine with anything. They talk over you, not to disrespect you, but because they've learned you won't mind. But you do mind. And the longer you go without naming it, the deeper the pattern gets. You become the person who goes along with everything, who's easy, who doesn't take offense. And eventually, you're not just ignored, you're depended on to stay silent. And the worst part, you think it's your fault. You think, maybe I'm just not assertive enough. Maybe I should speak up more. Maybe it's on me to make them take me seriously. But this isn't about volume or confidence. It's about emotional permission. Permission to believe that your presence requires consideration. That your ideas aren't favors, they're contributions. That your boundaries aren't preferences, they're needs. That your discomfort isn't overreacting, it's feedback. And if you've spent most of your life adapting to others, keeping the peace, making yourself small, you won't feel like you have that permission. You'll wait to be invited into importance. But respect isn't given because you wait quietly. It's given when you show people what you expect. Not through aggression, through clarity, through presence, through acting as someone who expects to be listened to, not tiptoed around. So how do you start? You begin by noticing the moments where you disappear. When you say it's fine and don't mean it. When you have an opinion and stay quiet. When you feel tension and bury it under politeness. When something hurts but you say, no worries. And then, choose one moment not to disappear. Say the thing. Pause instead of smiling. Let silence do some of the work. You don't have to demand. You just have to show up without softening your edges. Because the real shift happens not when others respect you, but when you stop explaining away why they don't. And that shift is slow. People will notice. Some will adjust. Some won't. But either way, you'll stop feeling like a tolerated side note. You'll start feeling like a full participant. And over time, the question, do they respect me, will become less important than this one. Do I act like I believe I should be? Help feels unsafe when you've spent years managing alone. There are people who turn down help, even when they need it, not because they're proud, not because they have everything under control, but because accepting help doesn't feel safe. It makes them anxious. It creates a discomfort that's hard to explain, not because they don't want support, but because they're used to not having it. If you've spent a long time getting through life without much support, your relationship with help changes. You stop expecting it. You stop waiting for it. You begin to shape your routines, your thinking, and your energy around the assumption that no one will be there. And after enough time, that expectation feels normal, even when it's no longer true. When someone offers support, your first reaction might not be relief. It might be hesitation. It might feel like a trap, or an obligation, or a setup for disappointment. You think about what it will cost, what it might mean, or whether you're revealing too much about yourself. You might hear yourself say things like, "I'm good, thanks," or "I've got it handled," without really thinking. These responses come out fast, automatic. They're not always accurate, but they feel necessary. It's not the gesture that's the problem, it's what the gesture triggers. You've learned to function while carrying too much. You've kept things to yourself. You've done what needed to be done because there was no one else. Maybe there was help, but it came with judgment, or with strings, or with withdrawal later. So now, even when help is offered kindly, your body tenses. This isn't because something is wrong with you. It's because you adapted to the world that shaped you. And in that world, help was complicated. Maybe you were made to feel that needing anything made you weak. Or maybe your needs were too often ignored. Or maybe someone once helped you and never let you forget it. Maybe you were punished for not having it all together. Maybe you learned that needing less made you more acceptable. Over time, help stopped feeling like connection and started to feel like a risk. So now, even when someone means well, it doesn't feel simple. It feels loaded. You find ways to maintain distance. You don't share things until they're over. You hold back what's difficult. You wait until you're in private to fall apart. You act okay before you are. The habit of managing alone becomes invisible. But it takes its toll. You become more tired than you admit. More disconnected than you want to be. More uncertain than you let others see. And yet, you keep moving through life as if needing help is a weakness. This mindset is often praised. People call it strength, independence, maturity, and on the surface, it looks like those things. But underneath, it's not confidence. It's fear of being vulnerable. Because when you've been alone emotionally for long enough, letting someone in isn't reassuring, it's disruptive. You're not sure what to do with it. You might ask yourself, what does accepting help say about me? Am I failing? Am I now dependent? Will they expect something in return? Will I owe them? What if I ask and they say no? These thoughts aren't exaggerated. They come from lived experience. And the brain remembers what it had to survive. So when you hear the words, "Let me know if you need anything," you don't feel comforted. You feel unsure of how to respond. You don't want to be a burden. You don't want to be seen differently. You don't want to risk someone changing how they treat you once they know you're not as self-contained as they thought. This is the deeper layer of self-hate. It makes you feel that receiving help confirms your fears about yourself. You fear it will reveal that you're not strong, that you're not capable, that you're disappointing, that you've failed to live up to the image you've maintained. But none of that is true. Wanting or accepting help doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means you've reached the edge of your capacity. And that's what help is for. It doesn't mean you're falling apart. It means you're no longer pretending that holding everything inside is sustainable. And that's a shift worth learning. Not because it's easy, but because the alternative, constant self-containment, becomes quietly harmful over time. So how do you make space for something that feels unsafe? Start by acknowledging how your body reacts when help is offered. Notice if you deflect, dismiss, downplay. You don't have to say yes right away. You don't have to explain yourself. Just observe your response. Ask yourself where it comes from. Ask whether you're responding from the present or from a history where asking felt unsafe. Then, try something small. You don't need to share everything, just enough to feel slightly uncomfortable, but not overwhelmed. Let someone bring you something. Let someone listen without trying to solve. Let someone stay even if you're not feeling okay. It will feel unfamiliar, but that's not a reason to reject it. The discomfort is not a warning. It's just your system reacting to something it hasn't practiced in a long time. Let yourself feel it. Let the awkwardness pass. And slowly, your relationship to help can change. Not by forcing yourself to become dependent, but by allowing the idea that independence and connection can coexist. That you don't have to do everything alone. That receiving isn't the same as failing. It's just another way of being human. You pretend you don't care because caring feels like exposure. Some people are seen as laid back, easygoing, unaffected. They seem calm in situations where others would speak up. They say, "It's fine," even when things are unfair. They don't seem to take things personally. They shrug off being overlooked, forgotten, or pushed aside. But underneath that calm is often something else, something quieter, heavier, and much more complex. For those who live with chronic self-hate, pretending not to care becomes a way of protecting what they actually care about the most. Caring feels risky, so they cover it, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they feel too deeply, and don't trust what might happen if that becomes visible. This isn't coldness. It's fear. If you've been hurt for showing how much you care, you start to associate caring with pain. Maybe your enthusiasm was mocked. Maybe your honesty was used against you. Maybe you were emotionally invested in someone who let you down, and now your system remembers what caring cost you. So now, when something matters, you keep it to yourself. You don't share your excitement. You hold back your opinion. You don't ask follow-up questions. You show disinterest, not because you don't want to be involved, but because you're afraid that being emotionally present will make you vulnerable. You act indifferent, but you're not. You care if you're left out. You care if someone misinterprets your silence. You care if a relationship drifts, but you rarely say any of that, because saying it would mean acknowledging how much it actually matters to you. And that feels unsafe. It feels like handing someone the power to hurt you again. This kind of detachment is a coping mechanism, not a personality trait. You become emotionally cautious. You avoid topics that matter to you. You pretend certain things don't bother you. You say, "I'm good either way," to avoid sounding needy. You don't chase clarification when someone's words confuse or sting. You let things go, even when they stay on your mind. You're not dishonest, you're just careful. Too careful. And that caution builds a pattern. People start to assume you don't have strong feelings. They think you're unaffected, emotionally distant, or just easy to be around. What they don't realize is that you've filtered yourself down to what feels safe to express. And over time, this filtered version starts to feel hollow. You show up, but not fully. You're in the room, but not connected. You're part of the group, but feel unseen. Because the part of you that would form real bonds, the part that cares, is being held back. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to build, not from external chaos, but from the constant effort to suppress your natural reactions. It's tiring to always play it cool, to always act like it doesn't matter, to stay quiet when everything in you wants to be understood, but to let go of that performance. You first have to understand why it formed. It didn't come from weakness. It came from experience. You learned that visible care made you a target, or made you look desperate, or opened doors to disappointment. So you stopped opening those doors. But the world isn't always that harsh. Some people don't punish you for caring. Some people respond to it with care of their own. but you won't find them if you never let anyone see what matters to you. So how do you begin? You start small. You let something minor show. You say, actually, that did bother me. Or, I was really hoping you'd be there. Or even just, that mattered to me more than I expected. These aren't grand confessions. They're invitations to closeness. And they slowly tell your nervous system, it's okay to reveal a little more. It won't feel natural right away. It might feel awkward, but you'll survive it. And if the other person responds well, something shifts. You realize that not everyone uses your care against you, that not every feeling leads to rejection, that not every emotional truth has to be hidden. And gradually, you begin to replace performance with presence. You stop masking detachment as strength. You stop pretending nothing matters. You start allowing yourself to be visible. Because the truth is, you've always cared. You've just never been sure it was safe to show. The uneasy mind doesn't trust stability. There are times when everything seems fine. No arguments. No losses. No problems demanding immediate attention. Life slows down. There's space. But instead of feeling peace, there's a discomfort. It's not loud. It's not urgent. It's subtle. A background noise that says something doesn't feel right. People describe it as waiting for the other shoe to drop. Others call it tension without a reason. Some don't even have language for it. They just know they can't relax. This isn't restlessness caused by ambition. It's not boredom. It's not about needing more to do. What's happening is deeper. The mind has grown used to instability. And now that it's gone, the stillness doesn't feel safe. This isn't a personal flaw. It's an adaptation. If your life has involved unpredictability, emotional, relational, environmental, then your nervous system has been shaped by that environment. You've learned to expect disruption. You've learned that calm doesn't stay. And if that was the pattern long enough, the absence of stress begins to feel unfamiliar. In unfamiliarity, the brain searches for a pattern it recognizes. If chaos was the pattern, calm will be met with suspicion. Many people with this wiring don't notice it right away. They only notice that they can't enjoy rest, or that they feel empty when things are quiet, or that they push away relationships once they become too steady. Not out of malice or avoidance, but because it begins to feel unreal. This is the mind trying to preserve what it believes is emotionally consistent. It tells you that this calm isn't real, that someone is faking, that something's going wrong and you just haven't been told yet, that you've forgotten something important, that things are too quiet. And eventually, you believe the voice, not because it's true, but because it's practiced. This becomes exhausting, not because of external problems, but because your system remains in a low-level state of alert. It's tiring to scan for dangers that aren't there, to prepare for breakdowns that don't happen, to mentally rehearse conversations that don't occur. The absence of a threat does not equal the presence of peace, especially if your emotional history hasn't taught you what peace feels like. It's tempting to assume this is just about anxiety, but it's often tied more closely to shame. When self-hate is a dominant lens, good experiences feel incompatible with how you see yourself. Stability feels like something for other people, people who have earned it, who are better equipped to handle it, who don't mess it up. So when you get something stable, a calm relationship, a healthy stretch of time, a phase of feeling okay, it clashes with the version of you that sees yourself as undeserving. The discomfort isn't just emotional, it's ideological. You don't trust peace because you don't trust yourself to be someone who can hold it. The idea isn't always conscious, but it shapes what you allow yourself to experience. You anticipate loss so that you're never caught off guard. You imagine the downfall so that you feel prepared. You leave situations early, not because they're wrong, but because waiting around for things to go wrong feels worse. These aren't overreactions. They're learned responses. And they don't vanish just because your circumstances change. Even if you're now in a more supportive relationship, even if you're in a more stable phase of life, even if no one is currently hurting you. Your system may still be defending against what it learned years ago. There are moments when it seems like peace should bring relief. But relief requires a body that believes it's allowed to rest. When rest feels dangerous, you'll find ways to return to what feels familiar, even if it hurts. That might look like starting conflict, sabotaging a connection, overcommitting, breaking routines, finding something to fix, or simply withdrawing. Not because you want to destroy what's working, but because you haven't been taught how to feel comfortable when nothing needs fixing. And that can be lonely, because from the outside, it may seem like you're not appreciating what you have. But that's not the truth. The truth is that part of you doesn't feel safe enough to trust that it's real. What helps isn't forcing yourself to feel gratitude. That usually turns into self-shaming. What helps is recognition. Recognition that your discomfort isn't irrational. It's familiar. That your mind isn't broken, it's adjusted. That the discomfort is just your system reacting to something it doesn't yet know how to hold. It takes time to learn that safety doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It takes time to experience calm without interpreting it as foreshadowing. The first step is not to push it away. When you feel the tension in moments of stillness, name it. Without judgment, name it like a weather pattern. This is discomfort. It's familiar. It doesn't mean something bad is coming. You won't convince yourself with logic. But naming the feeling allows you to sit with it, rather than react to it. Let yourself stay in calm moments a little longer than you're used to. Stay with the partner who didn't leave. Stay in the job that isn't chaotic. Stay with the quiet afternoon where no one needs you urgently. Let the discomfort come. Let it pass. Let it return. Let it soften over time. You don't have to force trust in those moments. You just have to stop assuming their presence is accidental. Eventually, the body catches on. The system learns that peace isn't always followed by punishment. That comfort doesn't have to be broken to be real. That good things don't need to be earned with pain. And over time, stability becomes something more than suspicious. It becomes something known. Not dramatic. Not euphoric. Just available. The pressure to be liked by everyone, even when you don't like yourself. There's a kind of pressure that doesn't always look heavy. It doesn't shout or demand. It hides in politeness, in perfect timing, in being easy to talk to. It shows up when you downplay your needs, agree too quickly, smile too much, laugh when you're not amused. This pressure doesn't come from arrogance or from a need to control others. It comes from something quieter. It comes from fear. When you don't like yourself, it becomes very important that others do. If they like you, maybe you'll be okay. Maybe you'll be safe. Maybe you won't be rejected. Maybe you'll finally feel acceptable. So you work to be liked. Not in obvious ways. In subtle ways. You adjust your tone. You avoid controversial opinions. You soften your edges. You learn what people respond to and shape yourself around it. You become pleasant, reliable, agreeable. You're the one people call when they need support. The one who never causes trouble. The one who doesn't take offense. The one who keeps things light. But after a while, something feels off. You notice that people like being around you, but you don't feel close to them. You hear appreciation, but it doesn't register as truth. You stay connected to everyone, but known by no one. That's because the version of you they know isn't false, but it's filtered. You've shared the part of yourself that feels safest to present. The version that protects you from being disliked. The version that avoids rejection by avoiding reality. The real cost isn't in what you give. It's in what you never show. You don't express anger because you fear being labeled difficult. You don't express sadness because you fear being seen as a burden. You don't say no because you fear being discarded. You don't share your full self because that self feels like a risk. This fear doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experiences, some early, some repeated, that taught you one message. People withdraw when you stop being easy. Maybe someone once pulled away when you were honest. Maybe you were praised only when you performed. Maybe emotional messiness was met with coldness. Maybe someone told you, directly or not, that your likability was the only thing that made you worth keeping. So you held on to it. You built it into everything. Your humor, your tone, your silence, your presence. And now, it's hard to stop, because the alternative, being disliked, feels unbearable. But here's the hidden problem. When everyone likes you, but you dislike yourself, it creates a gap you can't close. You get the approval, but it doesn't fix anything. You start to feel like a fraud. You hear the praise, but it doesn't register. You get compliments, but you assume they're based on a version of you that isn't whole. You try to maintain the image, but inside, there's a part of you that wants to drop it all. To say, I'm tired of being easy to like. I just want to be real. And real might mean messy. It might mean unpolished. It might mean conflict. It might mean disappointment. But it would also mean freedom. Because there's a kind of loneliness that only comes from being liked for the version of yourself you've created for others. And there's a kind of peace that only comes from being accepted without having to maintain an image. To get there, something has to shift. Not in how others see you, but in what you're willing to risk. It starts small. You say no and don't explain. You give an honest opinion without cushioning it. You admit when something bothers you. You show up without smiling if you're not in the mood. You allow the discomfort of being misunderstood without rushing to fix it. You watch how people respond, and you learn. Some won't like it. Some might leave, but others won't. And those are the people who start to see you, not the version you've managed, but the whole. And as they stay, the idea that you have to be liked by everyone begins to loosen. You realize that being respected matters more than being liked. That being known matters more than being accepted by the crowd. That being disliked for something real is less painful than being liked for something curated. And slowly, the need fades. Not all at once, but moment by moment, interaction by interaction. The part of you that tried so hard to be likable starts to rest. You stop checking how you're being perceived in every room. You stop adjusting for safety. You stop depending on others to hold up your sense of worth. And you begin, quietly, to like yourself. Not because everyone else does, but because you're no longer hiding who they're supposed to like.